Yesterday, I was walking back home after hanging out with some friends. I was sober and in my right mind. I've never been afraid to walk alone in the dark. I'm quite tall and intimidating looking from a distance, and I always bring a pocket knife when I know I'll be walking in the dark. Anyway, I was walking past some woods on the way back to my house when I heard my mother's voice calling for me. "Gabriel, help!" This was coming from inside the woods. I immediately recognized her voice and turned to look into the woods. She kept calling my name over and over. I couldn't see anything. It was far too dark to see through the trees. "Mum?" I called back, heading towards the woods. She sounded like she was in trouble and scared. I assumed that she'd gone for a run like she did every night, and somehow got lost in the woods. Then I realized it couldn't be her. She texted me only 10 minutes before asking me to come home soon to watch my little sister, so she could go on a run. I stopped dead in my tracks and called my mum. The voice in the woods is still calling my name and getting more frantic by the second. She picked up, and I immediately asked her if she was in the woods. She said no. She was back home with my little sister. I swear to God, as soon as she said that, her voice stopped calling my name from inside the woods. I was overcome with a wave of dread and fear that I'd never felt before. Something in the woods was trying to lure me in using my mother's voice, and it knew my full name, not just my nickname, which made things even scarier because the only person who calls me Gabriel is my mum. I immediately turned and ran faster than I ever had run before back home. When I got back, my legs felt like jelly and my lungs burned. I opened the door and there she was, my mother, sitting on the couch with my sister. I would think this was some sort of prank, but my mum isn't one for pranks, and even if she was, there's no way she could have gotten home before me without me seeing her. My only question is, what was in those woods? I work as a manager in an adult novelty store with a theatre, so please envision the kind of customers I get. I had this regular who was nice enough, and we always exchanged pleasantries and small talk. One day we said goodbye, and as he went to leave, he stopped dead in his tracks and came back to the counter. He told me that he ignores it every time, but today it wouldn't let him. Naturally, I ask him what he's talking about, and he proceeds to tell me that there is an older black man who is with me 24/7. He sees him every time I'm in the store. The older man just stands next to me, watching me and smiling. At that point, a chill ran up my spine, because no one in that store knows, besides my boss, that I'm half black, and that my 65-year-old black father that I was so close to passed in 2014. I said the usual, "Wow, oh my God," so I wouldn't give anything away to see what else he said, to see if it's legit. The customer proceeds to tell me that the man, my father, is sad about his kids not doing what he asked them to do, and one child in particular has greatly disappointed him. The man, my father, also wants the customer to tell me how much he loves his wife, even though she's married again. At this point I have tears in my eyes now, because how would this man know there's conflict between me and my siblings because of my father's death? How would this man know my mother is married again? He kept mentioning that he could feel a strong religious pull with my father. My father was a preacher. He told me a bunch of other things and asked if I was pregnant. I told him no, but apparently my next child will have my father's soul according to him. My 2-year-old son looks like my father and loves his favorite songs. I never saw the man again after that. My family and I lived at a large property called Gladstone Villa in the former mining town of Bargode in the Caerphilly County Borough of South Wales in the valleys. From 1969 to 1978, we experienced activity that simply defied rational explanation, such as lights going on and off. We witnessed electrical cables being pulled, and my grandfather Bill claimed to have a glass bottle thrown at his head as he entered the main bedroom, missing him by inches. I didn't personally see this myself, but I can still recall the time he came from there with the broken bottles in his hand and told us what happened. There was the occasional sighting, but this was very rare indeed. So rare that in all the 9 years I was there, I never once saw it, but I did hear it many times in the bedroom. It's still worth mentioning that my mother Caroline saw it on at least 2 occasions. There were also regular footsteps heard in the main bedroom every evening, sometimes during the day when we'd all be downstairs watching TV. One of us would turn the volume down and hear it more clearly, and my grandfather Bill would point to the ceiling and say, "He's by here, he's by there now," trying to make out where the footsteps were coming from exactly. There were 5 members of the family that were living at Gladstone Villa. My maternal grandfather William Higgs, known as Bill to family and friends, a retired miner who worked at the local colliery. He was a short, bald man who liked nothing more than to listen to his country and western LPs, Johnny Cash, Glenn Campbell, and so on. He also liked westerns on the TV that starred John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. My maternal grandmother was Rita Higgs. She was a short woman who was a housewife. She was completely teetotal but liked a smoke. She also liked collecting garden gnomes and watched soap operas on TV. My mother, Caroline Dexter, met my father at the local bakehouse in Baldwin Street. She was day shift regularly, and my father worked the night shift. He would stay behind to make her a cup of tea and chat. They dated for 3 years before they got married on Monday the 1st of April, 1968. The Beatles were number 1 with Lady Madonna. Very apt. They did not get a place of their own, but decided to live with my grandparents at Gladstone Villa, which was in Cardiff Road. I was born August 24th, 1969, when everyone was listening to the latest number 1 of the charts, Honky Tonk Woman by the Rolling Stones. It was soon after that my mother said that strange things started to happen. I was just a baby when she said it all started off rather quietly, like small tappings here and there, but nothing too noticeable. But in time, the activity gradually increased. One time my mother said the family heard a noise, like someone jumping down from the attic and onto the landing. Naturally, thinking that someone was trying to break in, they went to see what was going on. When they got there, they found no one, but the hatch to the attic was open. Whatever it was eventually occupied itself in the main bedroom, which incidentally was my grandparents' bedroom. It soon made its presence known by walking around the bedroom, and the sound of dragging could be heard. One day my mother went upstairs to that bedroom to get my father up for work, so he could get ready for his night shift. When she got to there, she was confronted by the sight of the ironing board placed on my father's torso as he slept. When he awoke, he was astonished to find the situation he was in. He suspected my grandfather Bill was playing pranks, but in time he knew my grandfather was not responsible for it, and he told his work friends what was going on there, and it got around that Gladstone Villa was haunted. My parents separated in 1972, and my father left Gladstone Villa, but it wasn't because of what was going on at Gladstone Villa. It was just a breakdown of a marriage. They finally divorced on April 25th, 1975. The British band The Bay City Rollers were #1 in the charts with Bye Bye Baby. Again, very apt. It would have been amusing, but for the fact of what was going on there. I was barely 2 years old, so I have no memory of my father living there. But he would come to see me every Saturday, take me to see my paternal grandparents, and to the local cinema. Great times, even though the paranormal activity persisted. As I got older, I witnessed the activity for myself. I actually saw the poltergeist activity for myself. I saw the electrical cables being pulled by unseen forces. I saw the lights going on and off, and when my grandfather Bill would play records on Sunday, as the family did at dinner, the music would turn off on its own. It took exception to the British band Slade and any religious TV shows my grandmother Rita would watch. The local police were also involved. I remember them popping their heads into the attic, hesitating and not going in, but they suggested it was my father playing a prank on the family. A family friend, Miss Ivy France, she was more of a friend of my grandma Rita. She was very skeptical when my grandmother told her that Gladstone Villa was haunted. I can still remember Ivy going into the main bedroom, looking around and saying it was a vibration from the traffic. But she was soon to change her mind when she experienced it for herself. It was then she suggested the local press and a medium. The medium was John Matthews, and when he came to Gladstone Villa he started by asking the family questions. He then began by challenging the spirit to perform knocking on the ceiling, and sure enough it responded by knocking back at him. At some point, John went into a trance to try and make contact, but he failed to get a name. He later confirmed the obvious, that there was indeed a presence there, and it was an earthbound spirit that had unfinished business. A priest by the name of Graham Jones was called to Gladstone Villa. He blessed the property, and after a few prayers he duly left. It was quiet for a few short months after that. No incidents, but it did return, and with a vengeance. This time it decided to show itself. One evening my grandfather Bill, my mother Caroline and I were watching television. My grandmother Rita was reading a book when all of a sudden my mother just so happened to look to her left, and she saw the full, solid figure of a monk standing by the doorway. We did not see this, as we were otherwise occupied, but she later described the monk in detail. Typical brown habit, complete with hood over the head, so she couldn't see the face. It sounded very much like a 16th century Benedictine monk. Fred Davies was also a friend of my grandfather Bill. They worked together at the local colliery, and he would visit most evenings. Fred was a slim man who would wear a flat cap and glasses, and smoked some homemade cigarettes that hung from his lips when he spoke. He would sit in his favorite chair by the open fire and talk to the family and watch TV with us. One day, Fred was with us, in his usual place by the open fire. I was quietly playing with my toys by the sideboard. It was quiet when all of a sudden there was one very loud bang. It was so loud that Fred ducked his head and I ran to my mother for comfort. When it was quiet, we went upstairs. My grandfather Bill would always be first and I would be last. When we go to that bedroom, we found nothing that could account for the noise. Fred later told us that he ducked his head as he thought it was going to come through the ceiling. Fred told us of another experience he had at Gladstone Villa. My grandfather Bill liked to look out the landing window that overlooked Cardiff Road into Bargoed town centre. This time Fred joined him, and he said he felt something brush past him. When he looked, there was nothing there. The most frightening experience I had was when I was alone in that particular bedroom. I made sure the light was on, it was very quiet, and I was laying on the bed facing the window that overlooked Cardiff Road, when I suddenly felt something heavy pounce on the bottom of the bed. I heard the bed springs go just once, and I felt the bed bounce. I didn't look straight away, but when I did there was nothing there. I went downstairs to tell my family, and we all went back up. We saw distinctive paw marks on the bed, like that of an animal. I later found out that my grandfather, Bill, had a black Labrador called Tovey, who died before I was born. My grandfather, Bill, and my mother, Caroline, claimed to have heard a baby crying there, but as I didn't hear it at the time, I took very little notice of what they said. The activity got so bad that my mother, grandmother, and I slept downstairs with the lights on. It was only my grandfather Bill who was supposedly brave enough to sleep up there. It was then that he himself had yet another experience in there. He told us he was lying on the bed when all of a sudden he couldn't move. He couldn't even shout for us for help. This could have well have been sleep paralysis, but he said he heard something in the room with him. My grandmother Rita had her own experiences. One day she went upstairs into the room to get my grandfather up, when she saw the boiler door room open all by itself. She didn't stay there to see what it was, but she rushed out the room. On another occasion she said she had the sensation of something pulling her under her foot, like she had stepped on this gown. We had the ghost for so long that my grandmother Rita gave her a pet name. She called him Johnny, and my grandfather Bill would shout out the name to provoke a reaction, but nothing happened. Ivy Francis's son Charles got to hear about what was going on at Gladstone Villa, and he came along with some friends, and with my family's permission they went into a bedroom. It frightened one of his friends, and to this day, he still says it was a spooky place. My mother Caroline had an operation on her toe and ended up on crutches to support her. The local nurse would tend to her foot, and my mother sat in the chair when the nurse came that day. The nurse knelt down to tend her, and she told my mother not to hold her. My mother looked at my grandmother Rita in amazement, as she wasn't holding the nurse at all. My mother made her own conclusions that it was Johnny the ghost that was holding her, so as not for the nurse to hurt her. The only time I heard the ghost being vocal was the time we were all in the room. One of us wanted to use the bathroom and we couldn't get in there. My grandfather Bill said, "He's behind there." I heard quite distinctively the sound of Gregorian chant, and that was it. Nothing more. We left in the summer of 1978 when two local businessmen bought the property, and Gladstone Villa was eventually converted into a small hotel, and its name changed to Reds Park Hotel. On the night before we moved, there was one final incident we experienced, as if it knew that we were going, and that it was its way of saying goodbye. My mother, grandmother, and I got ready to go to sleep. The light was still on, and then we heard the doorknob turning, as if someone was trying to get in. At first, I naturally suspected my grandfather Bill, as he was the only one who could have slept upstairs in that room, and we thought it may have been him playing a prank. I called out to him, but there was no answer, no laugh that would give him away. We then heard our belongings that were packed in the hallway being thrown around. The next day, I asked my grandfather Bill if he was playing a joke on us, and he insisted that he wasn't. And to this day I still believe him. I had my 40th birthday party at Reds Park Hotel in August 2009 for old time's sake, and it was the female staff that told me about the ghost, and I told them about what happened to me there 30 years before. The staff told me of their own personal experiences, the lights going off and on, the odd sightings in room 5. A bride in white was seen. Again, the claims of the baby crying that made no sense at the time. I did a thorough research of the property and the Cardiff Road area, and I found out some very interesting things indeed. I found out from the Bargoed Library and local newspaper archives that Gladstone Villa dates back to the 1900s, and it was named after the former British Prime Minister William Gladstone. I discovered the previous people that lived there, the Kimmitt family in 1924, a newly married couple, Michael and Evelyn Kimmett, and a son named Elvin. He died at 4 months, according to the archives. This may explain the baby my mother and grandfather kept hearing in the bedroom. Miss Evelyn Kimmett died in 1970, soon after I was born. Maybe this was why the activity all started. I also found that there was a monastery in Baldwin Street where my parents met and worked, and there was a property directly opposite, the former Gladstone Villa property in Cardiff dating back to the 16th century. It is now a public house called the Rafa Club. A priest hide is said to be there, but it's sealed up. This explains the monk my mother saw. What I have said here is true. I wouldn't share it with you if I couldn't possibly back this up, and I have used real names as not to hide anything, and all I have said can be verified by the family of those people mentioned. Sadly, some of those are no longer with us. I challenge any hardened skeptic and firm non-believer, and I can assure them that they will indeed most certainly question their belief system. Of this I have no doubt whatsoever. You may Google the property. It's still there on Cardiff Road, Bargoed, Wales, UK, very near Caerphilly in Cardiff. This place needs to be thoroughly investigated and is well worth documenting. My father was very no-nonsense, pragmatic, ghosts don't exist kind of guy. He briefly served in the army back in the mid-70s as a rescue and recovery specialist, or as he put it, simply multiple. The story he shared with me one night while we were out fishing. He had been in Gettysburg as he was a bit of a history buff and wanted to visit some places before settling down, marrying, and having kids. As he lay there in bed at night, it was 1 a.m. or so, and he was a very heavy sleeper. I witnessed this man legitimately sleep through a thunderstorm that flooded most of our downtown area. I've seen him sleep through a tree crashing down next to our tent on a camping trip, and this man would not budge. Back to my main story. He had been sleeping somewhere in or near Gettysburg, and had woken up in the dead middle of the night, feeling like he was being watched. As he glanced around the room, nothing really seemed out of the ordinary, until he heard footsteps in the room. He didn't really give us an idea as to what they specifically sounded like, but as he's laying in bed, he hears footsteps and then watches as the mattress near his feet compresses as if someone's sitting there. But there's nothing there. No silhouette, no body, just a depression in the mattress. As far as I remember, he was alone during this event. He didn't really freak out or lose his mind or anything like that, but he told me that this particular event made him believe just a little bit more in the unexplainable. I've always been a bit odd. I remember seeing color shadows of people since I was 5. I've had premonition dreams that come to pass. When I was in my late 20s, I was aligned with those that shared similar experiences. I delved deeper into my native Alaskan beliefs, yearning for more understanding. So a few years ago, an acquaintance/co-worker asked for help at her apartment, smudging as she felt a presence. I agreed, as I'd conducted a few in the past. I arrived at an hour to midnight and was met by my co-worker and another co-worker. The rest of the occupants were not at the residency. The apartment was quaint. The entryway, living area, kitchen, small bath, and 2 bedrooms. I began doing my thing, burning sage and chanting. I made my way through the rooms, and as I did, I kept hearing the name Lucy. I dismissed it temporarily. Once I finished blessing the apartment, my co-worker and I sat in the living room area. I had this nagging feeling to ask who Lucy is. Mind you, this living area was a TV stand, 2 sofas and a large square-foot rest, and a small door to a closet in one corner. So I ask, does the name Lucy mean anything to you? Can you tell me who Lucy was? The co-worker that lived in the apartment went behind the smaller sofa, and I hadn't noticed there was a walking space behind it. It was at an angle in the front of a window, and she reached down behind the sofa and returned to the square-foot rest in front of me and placed a pink gecko on the footstool, explaining, "This is Lucy." I was shocked, as I hadn't experienced an animal telling me its name before. I'd never met a lizard up until that point. The three of us were a bit awestruck, as I had no knowledge of her pet lizard. Lucy was quite happy to scurry all over me, climb up my neck, and remained nestled in my hair until I left. It was a beautiful moment that has me wonder if other people have had similar things happen to them. I met my wife when I was 26. I suppose it can be considered ironic, really, that it was a funeral which brought us together, especially considering the events I would experience upon moving in with her. I was never really a believer of the paranormal. I guess if we have to apply labels to ourselves, mine would be of a skeptic. Of course, like most people, I had watched various videos on the internet, read stories of hauntings, and occasionally indulged in the odd horror film or two. But my interests were only ever viewed from an outside perspective, and could only really be considered academic at most. Without a frame of reference, I found it hard to believe in these stories, and view them as anything but stories. That would soon change, however, as we quickly fell in love, and I moved in with her shortly after. She had told me about the house before I moved in. She had been living there for 10 years, before she had even met me, and by that time there was a lot to tell. Her friends had all experienced something there. They each had their own tale of the unknown. One of her oldest friends had an experience while staying over for the night, witnessed what can only be described as the outline of a woman move slowly through the room before dissipating abruptly into the darkness. He never slept alone in the house again. My soon-to-be stepchildren would often, when young, point to an empty space in the corner of a room and innocently ask, "Who is that lady?" A horrifying experience, of course, but discountable on its own, if it were not for the other children who would always say the same thing. Every single time they visited our home, it would always be the same question, and it would always be the same corner of the room. Things would only get worse. I remember how my wife recalls the odd smells which would materialize as if from nowhere, the unexplainable noises which would break the peace of the night, and foreboding feeling of not feeling quite alone when you knew you were the only person in the house. It did not take her long to reach out to a paranormal investigation team. They attended our home with Kieran O'Caffey, a paranormal investigator who enjoyed a brief stint of fame after being featured on Most Haunted, a television show which ran here in the United Kingdom. They brought along a psychic who not long after entering the home had an unnatural aversion to one particular corner of the room, which would soon become my new bedroom, and the particular corner where the children had witnessed the lady. Without any prompt, the psychic explained to my wife that the previous occupant of our house, a woman, had ended her life via rope in that very corner. She finished her reading of the house by sketching a picture of the apparition, a drawing my wife still keeps to this very day. Suffice to say, all of this did little to alleviate my wife's concerns. And this is where I come in. Poor naive me, brazen and full of all the misplaced logic that only a skeptic would apply to a situation which so clearly required it. Well, I even decided that our bed would go in that corner of the room. Looking back now, I can only lament at my childish bravado. My first night was unremarkable, of course. There was the typical excitement about me moving in, but nothing which could be considered otherworldly. At that point in my life, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but lacked any real motivation. That did not stop me, however, from tapping away at my laptop until the early hours of the morning, while my wife slept soundly in the corner. Around 1 in the morning was when it started. It began slightly at first, but it quickly became more noticeable as the minutes progressed. A sound, a noise of sorts. It sounded like scratching, and it was coming from the direction of our bed. I paused my work for a second and turned quickly around in the darkness, my ears directing me towards the source of the noise. My wife was still sleeping in the corner, her face concealed by the shadows. She lays stationary, blissfully unaware of the unnatural sound, which had itched its way from the wall near her head. Now, however, I gazed into the blackness of the room. The noise could no longer be heard, almost as if it were never there. A fleeting shimmer of imagination jolted into existence by my wary, fatigued mind. The room all of a sudden felt tight and confining. The walls, although stationary, appeared to have moved an inch while I was busy, closing themselves while restricting my movement. It was an odd sensation, one which burrowed deep, one which felt as if it would be with me for quite some time to come. Chalking the whole feeling up to exhaustion, I closed my laptop and quietly climbed into bed next to my wife. Predictably, sleep came soon. "What are you doing?" I inhaled deeply, my body swaying somewhat as my consciousness returned to me. "Baby, what are you doing down here?" It took a second for my mind to return to me, but when it did, I found myself awakening abruptly, standing on my feet in the middle of our pitch-black kitchen. "It's just after 2. Are you okay?" Even through the darkness, I could see the concern etched into my wife's beautiful features. Her eyes were wide and telling as her lips repeated her plea for answers. "Are you okay?" It took a second to collect myself, my confusion crippling in a heavy sort of way. "I am," I began, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "I think I was just sleepwalking," I added. My words sounded more of a question than a statement. My wife looked me over once before the concern drifted from her face. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, extending her arm out to me. "Let's get you back to bed." I weakly offered my arm and allowed her to guide me back upstairs to our room, where I quickly fell back asleep. Up until this point, I had never sleepwalked in my entire life. I talked in my sleep, sure, but never sleepwalking. That was news to me, and it was a disturbing sensation to say the least. It followed me into the next day and persisted throughout. Somehow it felt more than just sleepwalking. Somehow I just knew. The day passed like a dream, and before I knew it, night had fallen once more. "Do you want to talk about it?" my wife asked, lying next to me on the bed. I shook my head. Even though the room was silent, I still felt as if I could hear the scratching. "No, I'm fine," I lied, as I pulled the covers over and turned over. "Okay, I love you, baby," she whispered. "I love you too." It's dark, and I'm standing in our kitchen. I inhaled deeply and took a second to steady myself, my limbs shaking as the realization of what happened crept slowly through my body. This time my wife wasn't there to comfort me. This time, every single drawer had been removed from their cabinets and were now perched precariously on the various surfaces above. What is happening? Confused and distressed, I began to quietly slip each drawer back into the cabinet, which housed them, and then slunk carefully back upstairs to bed. Just before my fragile mind drifted back into the sleep of abyss, I felt as if I could hear it again, a scratching, tearing and cutting somewhere deep within the walls. I did not tell my wife of this second transgression. I thought she would only worry. Ironically, This seemed to make matters worse as she quickly picked up on my silence throughout the day as we continued unpacking the rest of my belongings. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting next to me on the sofa. I struggled to comprehend an answer. After all, what was wrong? I couldn't even fathom a response, let alone formulate the words required to convey the feeling which lingered deep inside me. My lips moved, and I found myself saying the first thing which came into my mind. "I think we should move the bed." She nodded slightly at my words. She knew what I meant by them, even though I never actually had to say it. "Okay, we can move it first thing tomorrow. One more night, okay? Because I'm shattered. One more night. I could make it one more night." The hours passed, and again the sky turned black as we drifted peacefully off to sleep. "Baby, stop, please, you're scaring me." Suddenly I was aware that I was not in bed. I was standing, but was still in the room. A few seconds later, I realized I was standing upright on the bed facing the wall. I looked down at my wife, the horror clear even through the darkness. "What?" was the only word which seemed to come. She was shaking, obviously. After a few moments of silence, she collected herself and brought her arms up to me. "Come on, come here." Confused, I once again allowed myself into her arms as she guided me back into the mattress. Her hand moved up to my hair as she began to run her fingers lovingly through it. "Shh, it's okay. Go back to sleep." My mind quickly sank back into nothingness. In the morning, she explained exactly what happened. She had awoken suddenly in the night when she realized that I wasn't laying next to her. After rolling over, she was shocked to find me standing upright on the bed, silently and still staring at the wall with my back to her. She tried to call out to me before I finally answered. Understandably, this shook her up quite a bit. I went on to divulge the second instance of my sleepwalking, and soon after we moved the bed from the corner of the room. To this day, we've never slept in that corner again. It's been 6 years since then, and we still avoid going anywhere near that corner. My sleepwalking has not happened since we moved the bed, and thankfully, I've never heard the scratching again either. To be honest, I try not to think about those 3 nights so long ago. It's hard to because I never really got any closure. If I had seen a ghost, if I could have at least pointed a finger, "Yep, ghouls." If I maybe had seen a rat or a mouse, I could have explained away the scratching. But there was nothing. It all just stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. The second we vacated that particular corner of the room. And I guess looking back on it now, that's the most horrifying part of it all. I will never know why these things happened. And even more hauntingly, I will never be able to predict if they will ever happen again. And that is the thought which lingers most during the dark nights, repeating with my mind as I tap away at my keyboard and hoping to God that I never hear that awful scratching ever again. As much as I do believe in the paranormal, I don't usually get the opportunity to experience it firsthand. I want to start off by saying that being from Hawaii, there are many superstitions that I still follow to this day, in respecting my ancestors and understanding my culture. I work in the film industry, and sometimes where we shoot tends to be in certain sacred locations back in the old Hawaiian days. For example, if it was just me on a hiking trip, I would have done to chant an oli to grant me safe passage. However, this job pretty much disregards those types of locations if it's considered a tourist area. We were filming at Waimea Falls, which has a rich history of the paranormal, located on the island of Oahu. As the day was wrapping up, I found out one of the crew members left some equipment back at the falls, and I volunteered on retrieving it. It was completely dark, and it was about a 10-minute drive via a quad to trek up the narrow path towards the falls. I had a colleague help me in locating it in the forest to no avail. I kept feeling eyes were watching us, and we shouldn't linger any longer. We decided to leave and got back on the four-wheeler to head back to base camp. As my colleague was trying to fix the gear, the headlights were beaming our exit. I glanced over to see a shadowy figure standing in the middle of our path. Thinking in my head, that's not right. I looked away, hoping it was only an illusion of some kind. I blinked, hoping I wasn't crazy, and I turned to see if the figure was still there. To my horror, the shadow figure stood 10 feet away from me, blocking our path in front of the headlights. Mind you, these lights were on high beam, illuminating the front road, and all the darkness tucked far back except for the figure. Trying not to cause any alarm to my colleague who didn't want to notice the figure, I quickly closed my eyes shut and told him to hurry up and drive. He asked what was wrong, but I didn't budge until we were back in our well-lit environment. I felt ashamed for causing a disturbance even though it was unintentional. I sent a prayer before my departure and hoped the being could remain at peace, but that experience was a shocker for the first time. Thankfully, it didn't follow me home. This incident happened last year in 2019. Unfortunately, I don't have any proof for the fact that I was completely chicken under those circumstances. Mahalo nui loa for reading this story. And please do not piss off any ghosts on your excursions, people. My 23-year-old mother was murdered when I was a baby. It happened in our house and nobody knew what actually happened. Throughout my life, there have been times where I feel like she's around, and the last few weeks, I felt like it non-stop. I don't have any form of audio or video to prove this, but I feel her, and I've seen her in dreams for years. So for a little backstory, her life was tragically cut short in 1998. I was 2 and the youngest of 3 children. I was the only one home when she died. My dad, brother and sister were on a mini trip for the week. I think why I feel her and my siblings haven't is because when she passed away, she knew I was still home, and I think she wanted to protect me and just hasn't ever left. So the house I mentioned where my mum's life was cut short, I used to see shadow figures pretty commonly. I never saw her, but I felt her presence from time to time since I was a kid. And I would see shadow figures, and at one point I drew them, but the drawings are on an iPad that is now broken. The 2 main ones I would see were a shadow figure wearing a hat, which I've read is pretty common. I never saw eyes nor face. It was just that, a dark mouse. This was always seen in the downstairs bedroom. The other shadow figure I would see a lot was a long, lanky one. I don't think I've read about them, but they were long and seemed to be slouched down. They usually looked like they have their heads held down like they were sad. Sometimes I would see 2 or 3 of these at once. I never saw these in my bedroom, almost always on the main floor of the house, and even if I looked at them, it's like they needed me to see them. Kind of rarely, but sometimes around the house I would see the hooded shadow figure, who again I think is a common one. The hats and hooded shadows always seem scary, but not the lanky sad ones. I wouldn't go near them if I saw them, but I never felt scared or hid when I did. So, there's been a time I've seen a ghost as well. I was in my bedroom upstairs. I remember I woke up and saw a bright ghost. I could see his face and uniform, and he told me to get out, which is when I moved my bedroom from upstairs to downstairs. The ghost almost appeared to look like a Civil War or colonial man. I'm not a history person, but he was definitely old-timey. The last story is one of my brother's friends that used to come over all the time and would always hang out in the basement. The basement was unfinished when we moved in, but we finished it, and the bathroom in the basement was always scary to me. It always felt like I was being watched in there, even though I never saw anything. So anyway, my brother's friend one day went in there and ran out and had my dad call his parents to pick him up. We didn't know why for many years, until one day he told us that he saw a full-bodied apparition of an old man with a big beard in there. After that, he never returned to our house. After we moved, I've never seen a shadow or ghost. It's been 7 years now, and I still feel my mum's presence, like I used to, in the old house. About 2 years ago, my nana brought home a Ouija board that she found at a yard sale. I've always been a true believer in the paranormal, and it's always been one of my peak interests. I've heard and read enough stories and watched enough shows to know not to mess around with a Ouija board. And quite frankly, they sort of freaked me out, so I wanted nothing to do with it. My nana, on the other hand, doesn't believe in the paranormal whatsoever, and thought it would be a fun game for myself, my brother, and the oldest of my 2 cousins. I left it on the dining room table for days before she made me put it away. I ended up sliding it under my bed in the hopes of just forgetting about it. My brother of 11 and my cousin of 12 bugged me about it constantly because they wanted to play with it and I wouldn't let them. I tried to explain it to them that it wasn't just a game and that it shouldn't be messed with, but they were preteen boys who couldn't help but do things they shouldn't. One day after I got home from work, the boys were there, and I had this sneaking suspicion they played with it. I looked under my bed and it was there, but I had this odd feeling, and when I went downstairs and interrogated them about it, at first they denied it, but I saw right through them and they finally admitted that they had played with it. I asked them if they had said goodbye when they were done, and they said they did. My cousin likes to over-exaggerate stories big time and make up details to be overly dramatic. So when he told me about a couple of things that supposedly happened, I didn't believe him at all. Also, they were boys who liked to mess with each other, so I assumed that that was happening now. A couple of nights later, I got into bed, and as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I get this feeling like I'm being watched. I look over at my closet that has 2 large sliding doors, and I notice that one of the doors is slightly ajar, which left a small space between the doors. It creeped me out for some reason, so I turned and faced the other way, trying to ignore everything and fall asleep. I finally fell asleep, and the next thing I know, I'm woken up by what felt like someone or something hitting me in the back of the head. I was laying on my back, so the back of my head was fully on my pillow, which made it even weirder. And it wasn't a light hit either. It freaked me out so much, I was shaking. I look around my room and don't see anything, but then, all of a sudden, I hear my floor creaking like someone is walking around my bed. I'm so freaked out at this point it wasn't funny. After laying there a good little while, I finally got the courage to get up and grab my phone and book it to my living room. I sat down and tried to calm, but I still could feel a tingling, pulsing sensation on the back of my head. I turned on my phone and realized it was 3 a.m. I called my boyfriend, now husband, with tears streaming down my face from being so freaked out. He didn't pick up, and I swear I called him another 15 to 20 times before I finally gave up. I sat in the chair until my nana got up around 6. I didn't tell her what happened, because I knew she wouldn't believe me and say that I was acting dumb. After she got up, I had breakfast, and called my boyfriend again, and he finally answered. He told me he had his phone on silent, so he didn't know that I had been calling. I gave him so much crap for this, and told him what happened, and he felt so bad and like an idiot for having his phone on silent. He told me he would have come over in a heartbeat to comfort me, and was so apologetic. Later that day he never came over, and we took the Ouija board to a junkyard to get rid of it. My husband is the only one in my family that knows what happened, and I didn't experience anything after I got rid of it. Moral of the story? Ouija boards shouldn't be messed with. Yesterday, my dad was all excited to finally buy this gorgeous one-story brick house in Indigo Lake, Texas. It was so elegant, refined, copious amounts of land to run around, a vista of sylvan charm. No annoying neighbors, unless they were on the road. We brought all of our belongings and finally came face to face with what was going to be a beautiful nightmare. As we unpacked and arriving at the steps, immediately, strange things started to happen. The protected door opened by itself, and even the grand door that led inside the house as well, just creaked loudly, as if it were telling us to go inside. My dad thought carpenters were working there, as it was still being worked on, but only a day or two to finally complete it. My brothers exchanged confused glances, and noticed the back of the house had this weird-looking pond. Behind it was a vast forest that had this sort of small cavern/grotto, which made absolutely no sense. We were wrapped in complete forest, so it was pretty creepy. We stepped inside, ignoring the doors opening, and were completely astonished with how beautiful the house was. I still remember being 7 years old and in awe, with so many things the previous owner left. It was like going back in time. Exquisite paintings, china vases, samurai swords, a chimney with a moose taxidermy above it. Oh my gosh, it was beautiful. To the right, as soon as you walk in, was the kitchen, and a strip down that led to the washing machines as well as the backyard. To the left of the living room was a fork. On the right side was going to be my parents' room. Straight led to a grand room, which we named an arcade room. It was a long hallway to get to the arcade room, and left of it led to another hallway. But what was odd of this was that there was a small shower and toilet, along with a long mirror that coated the wall and led to a door which was my brother's room in a closet. That made no sense. From my brother's room it led you back to the fork living room, and the restroom was in the middle. The arcade room was so cold. Even during summer when you opened the windows it was still freezing. Everyone who came would complain about how cold it was. Dad thought it was just a small draft. We had a foosball table, PlayStation system, video games, mini movie theater, and even a gym in that arcade room. Night falls, and my dad buys the Blair Witch Project. Yep, scared the hell out of me. We were taking care of my uncle's sweet chihuahua named Brandy, who out of nowhere began barking furiously at the wall in the kitchen. She had all her hairs standing up on her foamy mouth by how angry she was. I grabbed her and put her in the washing room where she just whined. My dad was dismissive of the idea that we were living in a haunted house, but that night after the movie ending was something I'm never going to forget, as this presence started immediately to show itself. I made the decision to sleep in my parents' room for a while. In that room was a painting of a boy and a girl on a countryside walk, on a road, next to a man who was behind. I'm getting chills just being reminded of this painting. My brother is snoring in his room, and my parents are awake, and we begin to hear loud furniture swinging and rustling across. The nails are scratching the walls, and these sort of chain noises are coming from the attic with a ch, ch, as if someone was calling a dog. Right then and there, man, my heart sunk, and I knew this place was haunted. My dad gets up and knocks on my brother's door, thinking he moved things, but he's fast asleep. The noises were brushed off, just a raccoon outside, or the forest trees swinging due to the wind. My heart is racing, and constantly thinking of the Blair Witch Project, which made it worse thinking it was real. Because, at the time, internet wasn't a popular thing to see if a movie was fake. I left a small night light on, and it was probably 11 or midnight when my parents fell asleep. As the night pressed, I dozed and woke up. My parents were sound asleep. The door of their room is completely open, and vividly remembered we locked it. My heart is racing, as I know something is really wrong. At the foot of my bed, the end is sunken down as if someone was sitting on it, and I felt it sink down. You guys, I felt it, and I was about to pass out and throw up. When suddenly the covers of my bed toss, and I immediately felt these hands and fingernails tickle my feet. I get chills remembering it. I kicked back whatever it was, and could feel the hairs on these hands. Just massive hairy hands and arms. I yelled. I got up from a nest of blankets and somehow jumped straight into my parents' bed crying. My parents console me. Dad gets up, turns the light on, and I'm done. Right there and then I'm crying in my mum's shoulder that I don't want to live here anymore. After consoling, my dad and mum are somewhat wanting to believe me, but they can't. That night I slept in between them. I didn't sleep. My eyes were glued to the door, waiting for it to open. Next day comes, and my brother is working out in the arcade room as he plays varsity football in high school. He comes rushing to us, saying he saw little girl's feet with frilly socks on near the hallway, with a lengthy mirror. My dad doesn't believe it, but he becomes a believer eventually. I'm going to go ahead to share the experiences that happened after. A few nights later, my father is in the bathroom. He had a habit of urinating sitting down at night, so that no one gets interrupted sleep. From the windows, the moon is able to reflect some light that gallantly pierces through. As my dad is urinating, he notices my mum is at the door and says he will be done shortly. So he does his thing, and right as soon as he's about to pat my mum on the back to let her go, my dad goes right through her. The silhouette, and he falls over. That night is the one I remember he finally became a believer, and shouting at us to come out, and turns on all the lights. He was as pale as a ghost, but I was relieved that I wasn't crazy. Water always turned on as well. Bath water, even the shower, where the long mirror hallway was. One time after a party finished and everyone went home, I took a long bath with my action figures and had a huge curtain that covered it. My mum sometimes would use the bathroom whenever I showered, so I heard her walk in and noticed the shadow pass and would just say, "Hey Mum?" No response. So whatever, off I played, and upon finishing the bath, the bathroom door was wide open. I came out telling my mum why she didn't close the door, and she said that she didn't use the bathroom and was outside cleaning up. It was scary. A lot of stuff went on in that house. We had family friends stay the night to look over the house while we went on a trip. That following night, they called us saying they were leaving as they were getting too spooked. The couple kept having dreams of a handsome man with hairy hands touching them, and he would laugh a lot. And his wife said that the painting in my parents' room was moving. She noticed the kids in the painting moving, and the television in that room turned on and the volume would flood up so high to the max. They left in the middle of the night, after a mere few hours. We were all painting the fence of the house, and saw neighbours jogging on the road. They approached us and told us the house had belonged to an artist who ended his life in our garage. No one ever got close to him, as he was always reserved and spoke to no one, but joggers would see him with art supplies all the time. No one ever knew who the girl that my brother saw was. Right then and there, my mum called her, who is a spiritual person, and told her to take incense and just walk around and talk kindly to the man and ask him to leave. After the small ritual, we never felt anything. Looking back, it feels odd to have been scared. Maybe he was just really lonely and in a dark place at the time, and was just playing with me, wanting his presence to be acknowledged. The carpenters even mentioned that they would see a girl roaming around our pond with this strange face scarf on. Funny thing is, my mum stayed at home while my dad worked, and while my brother and I were in school. She never experienced or heard anything. Anyway, we ended up selling the house because it was flooding a lot, and the creepy part about the grotto in the back, near the farmer's pond, was that after coming back from evacuating the floods, we found so many dead animals stacked on top of each other. Dog, geese, cats, 2 horse and owls. It just gives me the shivers every day. The arcade room is still frozen cold as well. I haven't been back, but I would be more than happy to share the paintings that he had in the house, as all of his belongings are in storage. This happened years ago when I was 17. I was up late watching TV and fell asleep on the couch. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. and dragged myself to bed. Everything seemed normal. The next morning my mum asked where I had gone the night before. I was really confused. The night before, she and my dad had been woken up by the sound of the front door opening and closing. They went downstairs at 2 a.m. and looked outside. My car was not in the driveway. They figured that I'd gone to give a drunk friend a ride home or something, so they weren't worried about it. My dad sat on the couch, the same one I had fallen asleep at and awoken on, and ate a midnight snack, watched some TV and went back to bed at 2:30. We figured out that I had fallen asleep sometime between midnight and 1:30 a.m. because that's when the TV show I remember watching was on. The soles of my feet were extremely dirty, as though I had been walking around outside with no shoes on. So I disappeared with my car for a few hours that night, have absolutely no memory of what happened, and if my mum hadn't have said anything that morning, I wouldn't have even known about it. In 2012, I suffered a massive stroke that ended my life. As I slipped away, I'd felt an overwhelming peace come over me like I'd never had before. Things went black. Then I was ascending above and saw the city below. Next to me, I heard a voice from this orb of varied colored lights that also had a mist coming off it. It was a woman's voice, and she was telling me how excited she was to finally be with her family and see her mum and dad again. I started to feel unsure and told her I wasn't supposed to be here. Suddenly I was standing in an otherworldly place that was gorgeous. All the structures and buildings were made of what looked similar to marble, but had an iridescent color between the marbling. The buildings were decorated with colorful stones with gold embezzlement lining the buildings and glass fencing. I walked along the path with my arms crossed and holding them to my body. I felt lost, and everyone around me was chattering happily with each other in these otherworldly clothes of satin-like linens. Some people held hands and were close and joyful with each other. This place was absolutely beautiful. I came upon an old man who was sitting near a tree, and what seemed to be teaching a class with people surrounding him. Some were sitting and others were standing. He called me over to join him. He was teaching the lesson of what life is supposed to be on Earth, what it was originally supposed to be, and how humans were supposed to be caring for the world and the inhabitants on it. But materialism had gotten in the way, among other things. I felt an overwhelming knowledge come over me as he continued to teach his class about the world, the universe, life and death. Everyone began to surround me and the old man. He put his hands on my shoulder and he said, "It's not your time yet. You will know when it is." The people from the class all came in and held me in a circle. and suddenly I was back. I opened my eyes and breathed in. I was alive and back in my earthly body. This is how I came to believe in God, and also reincarnation. I don't claim a religion, because my beliefs are now a mix of things. Unfortunately, slowly, that knowledge that was instilled into me slowly sipped away over the years. But I felt it in the back of my mind. To me, religion became several fingers pointing to the same being. I don't need a religion to dictate my relationship with God. If you're wondering, I'm 27 now, and suffer residual effects that have disabled me, but I keep going. My body may not work properly, but my brain still does, and I focus on expanding my knowledge in various areas. First off, I need to let you know that I don't believe in ghosts. I consider myself a rationalist and always try to look for a rational and logical explanation to things without jumping to a conclusion. That being said, I'm having a lot of trouble explaining what I've been experiencing in our new house for the last few months. Me and my wife recently moved into an old army home. They're offered to all acting soldiers in my country and are very cheap. Most of them were built in the 60s and 80s. Our house is at the very back of a much larger section, at the top of a hill and overlooks a valley with a dense native forest below. It's very cozy and offers a lot of privacy with no immediate neighbors and a good view. At first I had a couple of weird encounters that left me scratching my head, such as when I was walking from the front door to my car when I heard a loud banging on my tin roof, as if something hard, like an acorn, had landed on it and was bouncing down. Whatever it was, it bounced off the roof and into the branches of the tree in our front yard, which begins to sag under the weight of the thing. There were no branches hanging over our house that could have dropped anything, and I couldn't see any fall off the roof, nor did any land on the ground after it made the tree branches sag. I thought it was weird and mentioned it to my wife at the time, but just sort of brushed it off. Then there were the windows in my living room. Me and my wife live alone. I had our windows open to let the breeze in because it was a hot summer's night, and I decided to close them since it was time for bed. As I closed them, my wife called me outside to the backyard since she had spotted the International Space Station moving across the sky. After I came back in, I sat down on the couch, and I noticed the curtains were flapping in the wind. I walked over to check the windows I had just closed, and they were now wide open. I know for certain I had closed it just moments ago when my wife was outside the whole time, so she couldn't have opened it. I asked if she saw me close that window, and she said she was standing in the doorway and watched me do it. I kept asking her if she was messing with me, but I can't figure out how it could have happened. The last and most troubling incident was what prompted me to make this post. Last night, I went to bed just after my wife, who was already asleep. I lay in bed browsing on my phone when suddenly I noticed I could hear what sounded like heavy breathing. I stopped and listened for a moment, assuming it was just my wife snoring or something. But she was sleeping right next to me, and this sounded like it was coming from the far corner of the bedroom. I focused on the sound for what felt like several minutes, while being paralyzed with fear. I was convinced someone was standing at the end of my bed. I woke up my wife. She was half asleep until I said I thought it sounded like someone was in the house, which made her bolt up, and then she said she could hear it too. I then turned on all the lights and went around the house, checking all our locks and cupboards, and didn't sleep well that night. Has anyone experienced anything like this before? Am I just being paranoid? I'm usually quite level-headed, but this is starting to make me question my own sanity and judgment. When my brother and I were much younger, we'd have to stay at my grandparents' when my mum and dad went on vacation. This happened a lot, as my dad's company would allow my mum to go with him on business trips. There was only ever one guest bedroom in my grandparents' room, so my brother and I had to share a double bed. My brother always fought with me about who had to sleep near the edge of the bed, as the other side was against a wall. I always lost and would settle in for a sleepless night. The only way I can describe it is every night, an hour after I got to bed, someone would sit down next to me. It never made me feel threatened, but it was always creepy to be hummed songs and have my hair moved. One night I had enough of it and had to get out of the room. As I walked out into the living room, I saw my grandfather sitting in his favorite chair. He looked up at me and asked if Ben and June had awoken me. I quickly asked who Ben was and what he was talking about. His story quickly unfolded. During his first marriage, he had a son who would have been 23 and engaged. Him and his fiancée came to visit one night and slept in the room. They left late that night after arguing profusely. My grandfather overheard that June was pregnant and didn't want to scare Ben. On the way home, they were hit by a drunk driver and both passed away. I went back to sleep, leaving my grandfather muttering for a good hour or more out in the living room. Sometime after he went to sleep, and I felt the familiar presence sit on the side of the bed with me. To be clear, my brother and I fought about it because he felt the same thing, and we never wanted to sleep on that side of the bed. He always assumed I never noticed it. There's a locally famous haunted road in my town called Upsom Road. However, it is more commonly known as Green Lady Cemetery Road. You can look it up online. There have been tons of reports of incidents on this road. It's a hotspot. If you grew up in my town, you've been down Green Lady Cemetery Road. I could go on for days about telling you the stories I've heard from others about this location, but I would rather tell you about the two experiences I've had on this road. The second one made me swear to never go down it, day or night, again. The road had never been paved. They've left it terribly bumpy and as a dirt road to stop people from going down it. Most times of the year, the town puts up barriers so no one drives through it. Not because it's a walking path, because simply they don't want people going down there. At one end of the road, there is an old piece of property that the town bought, that you'll often see a police car sitting in. If you decide to pull onto the road, you'll be pulled over immediately and be told you're trespassing, even though it is in fact public property. They can't legally stop you from driving down there, but most people don't know that and will turn you around. The road starts off as just a wooded dirt road. It's only about a mile long, and you can drastically see a change of scenery in a very short amount of time. As you pass the wooded area, you come up to a section of road where on your right is a small swamp, and on your left is more forest. However, nothing seems to be able to live out there. When you hit this section of road, you're officially in the hotspot. If you park your car and look around, you'll notice that trees don't seem to grow there. They are all dead and rotten. You will not hear birds chirping. It's dead silent. Going just slightly further up the road, just past the swamp, is where things get very eerie. On the left-hand side of the road is a very, very old cemetery where the Green Lady stays. The headstones are all dated from the 17 to 1800s. There's also a small foundation next to the cemetery where a house used to stand. It's been reported time and time again that people have witnessed a green mist floating around the cemetery. People have seen this green mist form into the shape of a woman in a dress, walk back and forth around the cemetery. And there are a few theories as to who this woman is, but I'm not completely sure anyone knows exactly who she was. Anyway, it's a bit of a rite of passage. Here in town, where every kid who gets their license drives down the road at night, just one time to be able to say they've done it. Here are my 2 stories about it. When I purchased my first car, the first thing my friend Jordan and I did was take a drive down that road. I'd picked him up at his house at around 10:30 at night, and we drove over there. It had been extremely hot that day, and towards the night, it had rained a bit and cooled down a bunch. That combined with the swamp being on the road, it was so foggy you couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of you. It was absolutely the worst time to be driving down there, to be honest. We'd both been a bit nervous and the fog wasn't helping us at all. We had been creeping down the road slowly, so we couldn't really see where we were going. We had gotten about 200 feet from the cemetery when a teenager comes running out of the fog and runs right past our car. We didn't recognize him, but this kid was bolting down the road. He was dressed in a grey Nike t-shirt and black baseball shorts. He looked like he was about our age, so we were even more confused that we didn't recognize him. Jordan and I both agreed that the kid looked like he was running away from something, so we decided to turn around to offer him a ride. Mind you, there is a ton of bears and other large carnivores here, so we thought perhaps something might be chasing him. I quickly turned the car around and started driving back in the direction the kid was running. We drove for a little bit but didn't see him. The fog had started to clear up a bit, so we were able to see a decent distance in front of us, but we still couldn't see him. He wasn't on the road. He wasn't in the forest. He was simply gone. I rolled down my window and started to yell, "Hey man, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" hoping that the kid would pop out from behind a tree or something. But nothing. The kid was simply gone. Maybe he was some kid who decided to walk down that road at night and got spooked. Maybe he saw headlights and thought we were cops and hid from us. We still don't know to this day. We had asked around in school the next day if anyone knew of anyone who went for a walk down that road at night, but we never heard anything. If there was a kid out there that late and he ran up into the forest, that's even scarier than the thought of the ghost teen running past our car. I'll never forget the look on that kid's face as he ran past our car. He looked like he was scared, panicking, and I really wish I were able to find out who he was. Now for my second and final experience. Jordan, the same friend from the previous story, had gotten his first car, so obviously the first thing we had to do was go down the road. The weird thing about this drive is that once again as we got closer to the cemetery, a thick layer of fog had started to pour out of the trees from the swamp, although the weather had been the same all day, with no rain and no temperature drops, nothing. Luckily this fog wasn't as thick as before, and we could see in front of us. We'd gotten up to the cemetery, and Jordan parked the car. We sat around for a little while and looked at the cemetery. The forest just observed everything. After 5 or so minutes, Jordan looks at me and says, "Dude, how weird would it be if I looked in the rearview mirror and there was someone in the back seat?" Who says that? I mean honestly, dude, look where we are, it's not even a joke. That's seriously not funny, bro, I told him. He looked up in the mirror and screamed. I spun around, looked in the back seat and there was nothing there. He started laughing. "I got you, bro." "Again, you're not funny, Jordan." He didn't want to keep wasting the gas, so he turned off the car and shut off the headlights. Now this idiot has us sitting on a famously haunted road in the middle of the night, in the pitch darkness surrounded by forest. We're parked right in front of the old building foundation of the cemetery. It's just ahead of us. We sat there for a few minutes smoking cigarettes and talking about nonsense. I'm kind of staring off into the trees at this point, honestly a bit bored, when out of nowhere Jordan says, "Hey, there's someone in the forest." I shrug it off, assuming he's messing with me, when I see a subtle light in the forest behind the cemetery. It looked like a flashlight with batteries that were as close to dead as they could be. The light vanished after a few seconds, and we both sat there with our eyes glued to the patch of forest. Roughly 30 seconds later, a tall, ovular light started to appear in the same spot, that the light came from. Jordan says to me, "Okay dude, I'm done, let's go." And I'm telling him, "No, hang on, wait." His hands are on the key. He's getting ready to start up the truck and drive away. The light was very faded, a little hard to see, but when the forest behind it is pitch black, it stood out. It slowly started to move along the rock wall at the back side of the cemetery, and Jordan started up the truck. He was so ready to leave. As his headlights kicked on, we saw a green mist floating around the road. Jordan yells out, "Screw this," and slams the truck in reverse and backs up until he felt far enough away to turn around. We had always heard reports of the green mist. Supposedly, if you wait long enough, you'll see the green lady walk around in the mist. But we were too scared to wait for that to happen. I never thought the green mist was real until that night. And to this day, I swear I will never drive down that road ever again. I highly recommend you look it up. It's probably one of Connecticut's most famous paranormal hotspots. When I was 5, me and my identical twin sister both caught scarlet fever. We are from America, but my dad's project had temporarily relocated us to India, and we were not used to the water and food there. We both fell into a coma towards the end of the fever. One day, I woke up, and my mum and aunt were screaming and crying and holding my sister, because she was unresponsive and not breathing. They were doing chest compressions, CPR and the like, but nothing was working. I was desperately trying to get their attention because I was young and didn't understand what was going on. I went back to my room to go back to sleep, but in the corner of my room where my sister's bed was, I saw her laying there breathing fine. I went back out to the living room and realized I was looking at myself in my mum's arms as she tried to revive me. Eventually I saw my eyes flicker open, and then everything went dark. I woke up a few weeks later in the hospital next to my sister and my mum, who ended up catching it because of us. My mum told me I had almost passed, and they were trying to wake me up, but I was unresponsive, so the ambulance took all 3 of us into the ICU. To this day, I'm still unsure how I witnessed my almost death. I'm 23 now. This started when I was 3 or 4. Everything that happened that night, I remember like it was yesterday. The memory is so vivid and forever in my mind. The second floor of my house at the time was really just a small landing with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom off it. Immediately at the top and to your right was my bedroom. The bathroom adjacent to the stairs, then my sister's bedroom, and my parents' bedroom. My mum would put my sister and I to bed at 7 o'clock every night. I always had issues falling asleep as a kid, but would eventually drift off. My bedroom had a closet next to the door, and next to that, 2 windows with a dresser sitting between them, with my bed pushed against the wall, foot end of the bed near the door. One night, not unlike any other, we're put to bed and I finally find sleep after a few hours of just lying there, only to wake up some hours later. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning. I rolled over to scan my room. I've always been afraid of the dark, so the room was lit up and my nightlight was plugged in at the end of the bed. Standing in front of the window furthest from me, near the closet, I saw what I thought at the time was an angel, quite literally glittering gold in front of my eyes, standing at least 7 feet tall, staring out the window. My movement must have grabbed its attention, because immediately its head turned to look at me. There were no facial features except for a strong, defined jawline, though faceless. It wasn't like a freaky facelessness. At this point I was more curious than afraid. Then it started to yell at me. It kept telling me to shut up. The yelling quickly turned to screaming and I freaked. I was one giant goosebump, and I got up from bed, opened my door and looked into the lit hallway. My parents always left that light on at night in case my sister or I needed something or got scared in the middle of the night. Almost in slow motion, I noticed the air felt too still. Something was off. Before I could process anything, I took one step forward, and out of the bathroom shoots this thing. It gets right in front of my face, screaming a blood-curdling scream that still echoes in my ear to the day. The face of this thing was just grey and sinister. Eyes completely blacked out, skin cracked, no lips, just a black hollow hole with the screams coming from it. Long, black hair flying around, as if there were a fan switched on behind it, and I lost it. I screamed so loud, I swear the entire house shook. I barged into my parents' room, tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. My mum looked scared and confused. My dad, just terrified. I don't remember what happened after that. I'm sure I told my parents what happened and ended up sleeping with them for the next few weeks. Growing up, I asked my mum about that night, and she explained how I barged in crying, rambling off some story about an angel or something. Today, I don't know what it was. My dad, on the other hand, never said much about it, and instead started warning me to stay away from Ouija boards, and told me some freaky stories about things that had happened to him. As my parents divorced, growing up, things got worse, with respect to what I was being exposed to. My dad would show me scary pop-up videos and play creepy music. I was 6 or 7 at this point. Safe to say I hated going to my dad's, because I thought whatever I'd seen that night was somehow connected to him. Eventually my mum remarried. We moved and things were okay. Then I decided to stop seeing my dad completely, for unrelated reasons, as I was 9 years old at this time. And that's when things started again. The air was ridiculously heavy all the time. I hated sleeping in my room. I always felt like there was something at the end of my bed, just watching me. I tried to ignore it. For 9 years, constantly living in fear, we moved out of that house to somewhere around the corner. And once my mum and stepdad divorced, that way we wouldn't have to switch schools as I was about to graduate high school, and my sister still had 1 more year. I still had access to the house as my ex-stepdad still lived there. They were using my old bedroom for storage and always kept the blinds closed, as I had while living there. One morning when everyone in my old house was at work, my friend and I decided to sesh in the garage quickly. We had the okay from the ex-stepdad, so long as we weren't driving anywhere afterwards. We walked through the front door, through the foyer to the garage, and got settled. I could already feel the extra 10 pounds on my chest, and I really wanted to make this quick. I had previously spoken with my friend about what I was feeling in this house, as we had been friends for years at this point, but never gave her much context. Not even 5 minutes into the sesh, we heard the footsteps above the garage, i.e. my old bedroom. My entire body went cold. My friend immediately looked at me, and we waited for another second and heard them again. This time, like a stomp type running around the room. We said screw it, packed up and got the hell out of there. I locked up and walked down the driveway completely freaked, trying to push the thousands of thoughts running through my mind out my head. Then, my friend let out a tiny shriek. I turned back to immediately ask her what was wrong. They were doing some work. I thought she could have stepped on a rogue nail or something, but the horror was written on her face, and I looked up at the window where the blinds were closed. I asked her again what was up. She said for whatever reason she felt like she needed to look up to my old bedroom. She said the blinds were open in the window looking down on us, and I quote her words, "This thing, with black hair and black eyes and cracked skin, and just a hollow black hole for a mouth, was staring down." She said it so fast, terror was oozing from every word she said. That's when she burst into tears, and so did I. I was too freaked out to tell her what happened when I was a kid, and I didn't want to scare her more. I suggested we get the hell out of there. Since then, nothing's happened. I recently traveled to Rome, specifically the Vatican, and got a blessed St. Michael pendant for extra measure, seeing as whatever it was followed me in silence throughout the years. The thing hasn't bothered me other than showing up in a very specific nightmare I've had every 8 to 10 years since my first encounter. If this thing is still on my tail, I'll be due for a nightmare within the next year. I live in a really old house, at least 400 years old. Last summer my parents were gone for the weekend and my sister was staying at a friend's house, so I was alone. It was a warm evening and I was sitting in the garden browsing Reddit, when suddenly my dog, who was laying beside me, jumps up, and I immediately noticed the hairs on her neck standing up straight. She pointed her nose up in the air, sniffed for a bit, and started barking. She usually never barks unless someone is entering the house, so this put me on edge. Now it's important to know the layout of my house, which actually consists of 2 buildings. The first building is where you enter, then you walk through the garden to the second part where we live. The first building is still being renovated. You can't enter the second building from anywhere else, so if someone was entering the house, my dog should have been barking towards the first building, but she wasn't. Instead, she was barking towards the second floor of the second building where my room is. I tried calming the dog down, and she eventually stopped barking. Because there's no way of entering the building without having to walk through the garden past me, I thought she must have heard one of our cats or something, so I didn't bother taking a look. Later that night when I went to bed, I noticed a side window in my room was open. I never opened this window because you look straight into our neighbor's garden and he really values his privacy. I closed the window thinking my mum must have left it open or something. That night, I remember having some weird nightmare about a break-in. The next morning when I got up, my sister was home, and she told me that when she came home in the morning she found me sleepwalking downstairs. That was surprising because that rarely ever happens. She also said I was babbling about some person climbing through a window. Fair to say, I already shat my pants around this time and went back up to my room, and surprise, surprise, the window was open again. Just to clarify, you cannot open the window from the outside. It's simply impossible. I checked around the house to make sure there weren't any signs of a break-in. I didn't find anything, and since that night I've been sleepwalking more frequently. Some days I wake up with clothes on, while I went to bed wearing jogging pants. Other days objects in my room are misplaced, and I've even sent messages in my sleep to a friend of mine. The messages are always cryptic, so I don't really know what to make of them. For example, the first message I sent in my sleep to my friend went as followed: 9, 18, 9, 19, okay. After explaining to my friend that I had been sleepwalking and telling him about the side window, he suggested it may be something paranormal. I once told him about the murder of a woman in the 17th century that took place in my house, and he said it could have something to do with it. Personally, I am skeptical about this. My best theory is that the messages have something to do with whatever I was dreaming about. However, every time I notice I've been sleepwalking, the side window is open. I decided it could just be my sleepwalking self opening the window, so I decided to test this theory by putting a lock on the window and giving my sister the key. This meant that next time I would be sleepwalking, I shouldn't be able to open the window by myself. This was not the case. A week later, I woke up with clothes on, which meant I had been at it again. I checked the window, and to my horror, the lock was gone and the window open. Well, it might have been my sister, right? No. She told me she still had the key and had not given it to me, or anyone for that matter. After this, I boarded up the window and put some extra locks on it as well, just to be sure. After that day, I have not been sleepwalking as often, and the window seems to have stopped opening on its own. But I still notice my dog staring towards my room some evenings. I always hope it's just the cats. I was around 11 or so, and was just laying in bed thinking about stuff to help me drift off into sleep. I had an issue with sleep, hence why I tried to avoid it. So I just lay there, and out of the blue, loud music started blaring into the room. It was so loud and sounded like a mix of hip-hop and rock. Now usually I would love to hear some of that, but I couldn't even tell where it was coming from, and it almost sounded like a fire alarm going off. I lived in an apartment at the time with my family, so I just closed my eyes and hoped for them to rush in, but they didn't. It makes no sense that they didn't hear it, since it's a pretty small apartment. I just laid there frozen in fear with my eyes shut, and after what felt like an eternity I stopped. I still didn't even open my eyes, expecting something to be right in my face. I just lay there, acting like I was asleep until I finally was. I wake up in the morning to talk about it with my parents, and they chalked it up to a bad dream. It is possible, but it was so vivid and real. Too much continuity. I could hardly even remember the music. I remember trying to play it in my own voice to my parents. So to this day, I assume it was an exploding head syndrome attack or something. Some psychological sciencey experience caused by poor sleep. At least, that's what I tell myself. A few years back, I was at my grandmother's funeral. My dad, brother and I had all gotten there early because we'd made good time in traffic, so we were waiting for my extended family. We ended up wandering around the cemetery. My brother and I were trying to find the oldest grave. Weird, I know, but my whole family are big history nerds, and graveyards can be pretty cool as long as you're respectful and stay on the paths. We walked past this one grave, and I just immediately felt awful. I became extremely cold and nauseous, even though it was warm and sunny. My breath caught in my throat, and I could no longer breathe, and my vision started spotting, and it all went dark. I thought I was going to pass out, and then it just stopped, just as quickly as it had started, and I felt fine. My brother was still saying whatever he was saying before. I missed about a sentence, and hadn't noticed anything. I didn't tell him about it, figuring he wouldn't believe me, so I just said we should head back before the funeral began. I probably would have dismissed the incident, except the next spring my brother and I were hanging out and climbing trees in a park. It had a lot of tall grasses you see in prairies, and a good number of trees as it backed up onto the woods. I started climbing a tree. I'd gone up a few times before, and then I got hit by the same feeling. It was the sudden nausea, inability to breathe, and vision fading out. It was identical to what I felt at the cemetery. I dropped out the tree and had to sit down until it passed. After that, I convinced my brother to leave because I felt sick, even though, after it passed, I felt fine. They found a body in the woods by the park a few weeks later, mostly decomposed because it had been out there all winter. Creeped me out beyond belief, and I've never had that feeling since. My best friend Amy and I have been inseparable since age 11. I basically grew up at her family's beautiful 80-acre farm in Ontario, Canada. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and I have countless good memories there. I even got married there a couple of years ago. With the good memories, there are some that I cannot explain, and it has made me reconsider what I know of the world. When Amy's family bought this property 20 years ago, the heritage farmhouse that came with it was in terrible shape. It was over 100 years old, and it's your typical red brick Canadian farm. When they arrived, the kitchen floor was caved in, open like a pit. It was full of bones. They assumed that it was perhaps a garbage chute below the cooking area, but there were many different kinds of bones, including animals we typically don't eat. Weird. But they went ahead and filled it in and repaired the house. Over the years, they have transformed the place dramatically, and it's been cool to watch the process. When we were 12, Amy's youngest sister Chloe came up to Amy and I out of the blue and suggested we tie her up and put her in the cellar. It was obviously a weird request, but we obliged, thinking it would be funny. She was a bit of a brat, and it would give us a spooky thrill. We followed her down to the dirt floor basement, which of course had always felt like the creepiest place in the house, and proceeded to tie her hands and feet with some soft jump rope she had provided for us. She talked us through a list of things we needed to do in a quiet, monotone voice. We laid her down in the cellar, which had a heavy door to keep it cool, and she instructed us to turn off the lights and shut the door. The light was off for a second before she let out a blood-curdling scream. We jumped inside in a flash to see Chloe trembling, wide-eyed, and she had wet herself. To this day, I have never seen someone in a state like that, an honest, manic state of fear. She told us that the moment the room went dark, something heavy had shuffled in the room in a low voice and greeted her with a low rumbling, "Hello." The lights in the basement flickered, and she recalled the hello, and we all felt an enormous wave of icy fear wash over us. We scrambled to untie her and got the hell out of there. Can you remember how it felt running up the basement steps as a kid? Like someone was after you? Far more tangible than the usual childhood imagination. It was like something reached for us as we ran. We never played in the basement again. When we talked about it later, Chloe had no memory of ever asking us to tie her up, nor did she recall even going down to the basement. She was very hurt that we had done that to her. This annoyed Amy greatly, as she thought Chloe was just trying to get us into trouble. But Chloe never told her parents, and based on the glossy look in her eyes when she asked to be lowered into the cellar floor, I believe her. When we were 15, everyone in the house was having weird experiences. Going upstairs to the bathroom, there was always something in the corner of your eye rounding a corner or peering at you from a doorway. It was unsettling to say the least. As we went through the goth and emo phase, Amy started to mess around with potion making, pentagram items and other oddities. I didn't necessarily credit Amy with this, but things started to get kicked up a notch after that. I was there for a sleepover once, in summer. Amy and I were sleeping in her bed, and she had an alarm clock that would project the time on her ceiling in that typical red segmented alarm clock font. Weird things would always happen at certain times of the night, and we would watch the red numbers and hush our girl chat at those times and listen to the house. Midnight, 1:11, 2:22, 3:33, and so on. One morning I woke up just as the sky was starting to lighten. I needed to use the bathroom, and was sleeping on the inside of the bed against the wall, facing Amy's posters. I rolled to my back to check the time, and I could not see the hour. My blurred, sleepy eyes focused harder, but something black was obstructing the time. My eyes widened in terror as I turned my head towards Amy and realized the blackness was an entire human figure, floating in the air about a foot over Amy. It looked like a mirror of Amy, but with no discernible features or form. Humanoid, but wrong. It was not dark in the room. The morning light had filled her room with a dull grayness, and I could see details across the room. I stared at this figure in horror, moving my eyes up to its empty face. No mouth, no nose, just emptiness. When my eyes met the full face, bright white eyes shot open and stared at me with an unbearable intensity. I shut my eyes in a flash and lay there, frozen and terrified for what felt like hours. I have never felt that level of fear in my entire life. I never heard a noise. I never felt a touch, but I felt the intense eyes upon me. At 7:30, Amy woke up, to use the bathroom, and listening to her hum a tiny bit eased me enough to crack an eye open. Everything in the room was normal, and Amy returned to the bed with a thud and resumed sleep. I nudged her and asked if she could escort me to the bathroom. I told her about what happened later that day, and she was less than pleased to hear about it, and had a hard time sleeping in her room for a while after that. I'm absolutely certain I was awake, and there was not a single ounce of tired left in me when my eyes met whatever that was. I would like to share a story. In Croxley near Watford, Hertfordshire in the UK, there's a moorland with a river running along it. Halfway down the moor walking west, the river juts to the right, northwest, and the bank rises up a metre or so. On a hot, bright summer day, I was walking along towards the raised bank of the river. As I got to the peak, I looked into the river, and there was a man in there. He was big, 6'4" if anything, long-bearded and quite fat. In the water up to his waist and apparently naked. He looked at me with shock on his face, as if I had startled him, or he hadn't expected to be caught having a dip. So as to not embarrass him, and because I was unconcerned, I waved a hand casually and kept walking along the bank. I intended to look away, and kept looking away, allowing him to salvage his modesty. But the river turns up the bank, and so I had to turn. No more than 3 paces on, and it was clear from peripherals that he had gone. I was standing on a high bank, slightly elevated over the surrounding land. I can see both ways along the river for over 100 meters, and he's just vanished. There was nowhere he could have gone. He wasn't underwater either. It's barely waist deep, and slowly moving and clear. He never even left a ripple in the water. It took me several minutes to accept he hadn't been real, despite seeing him for no more than 3 meters away, in bright sunlight. I didn't realize he was a ghost until he vanished, and that made him the oddest ghost I'd ever seen. I was about 19. My best friend had become friends with a guy called Chris. Chris lived with his mum, Crystal, in a small house located in a village in Cumberland. Crystal was really cool and would let us hang out there. The house was built in the 50s or 60s. All the doors in the house were glass. The living room had 2 entrances with double doors, and there was a conservatory on the back of the house, which the other doors led to. Basically at night, no matter where you stood, you could see everywhere on the ground floor, either directly or reflected in the conservatory. There was a small garden with a fence, and then the woods. The people in the village itself were weird. We would have a nervous laugh about it being like the Children of the Corn, Village of the Damned, or the League of Gentlemen. The kids in the street would stop and stare as we walked by. Shopkeepers would stop what they were doing and smile, but never say a word the whole time. People walking down the street would either be mumbling or laughing to themselves. On a few occasions, they would walk until just past us, scream and then run off down the street, as we all stood looking bewildered at each other. And I would say, I hope you know we're all gonna pass here. I'm not exaggerating when I say that is how everyone was on the street. They behaved in that way without fail. It was creepy, absurd, and a little bit hilarious. One day me and my friend Bud went to the local pub, where everyone stopped and turned to look at us. The pub was full of men in polo shirts. Anyway, you just need to understand the nature, the surrealism of this place, where everything was quite strange. It wasn't long into my first visit before we got Crystal talking about some of the weird things that go on, not just in the house but the whole area. She had collected newspaper clippings from the local paper to back up some of her stories. Here are some events that I remember she told me. If you've ever heard of the Bonnie Bridge UFO sightings, on one of these occasions, a UFO was spotted near the village. The woods were well known in the area for the amount of bodies that turned up. It was rumored that a coven of witches practiced black magic in the woods. People said they had seen robed groups of people in the woods and white horses in nearby fields. People had been found with their lives taken where the trails cut off. Chris and Crystal told me one night the entire street was out in the backyard. There was chanting coming from the woods. They said it was so loud it must have been at least 50 people. Men, women, deep voices, high voices. Crystal said the creepiest part was as soon as the chanting stopped, it would instantly start in another part of the forest, like they were jumping from one part to another, or a group of hundreds of people throughout the forest were performing some perfectly coordinated chanting in the dark. To a bunch of teenage adventurers, this place was crazy. Crystal also mentioned that strange objects had been left on the steps in the backyard, feathers and twigs tied with twine, and a few times robed figures standing just beyond the fence. Well, that was all mind-blowing. And then she started to tell us about the house. Both Crystal and Chris refused to use the second-floor bathroom to go in to the spare bedroom. At some point, Crystal had noticed scrabbling sounds coming from the loft. She assumed it was either a rat or squirrel that had gotten in. Also that all the spoons in the house had started to go missing. Each time she returned to the house, another spoon was gone. Finally, there were no spoons left, and she tore the house apart trying to find just one with no luck. She searched everywhere except the spare bedroom. She was pumping herself, getting ready to go in, when she heard a bump from the loft. Oh no, she thought. There's someone living in the loft. She called the police. Chris had come home from a friend's house at this point, and they both listened to the bumping and scrabbling as they waited for the police. Even the police heard it when they arrived. They pulled down the hatch, went in, and found nothing, except all the spoons laid in a row in front of a burned-out candle. The policeman, straight-faced, suggested she get an exorcist. They never told me why they didn't go into the other rooms, but Crystal believed she was cursed and that her ex-husband had something to do with it. Despite the honesty in their face and the clippings and all the things I'd experienced in my life, at that point I was skeptical. It's hard to let go of that, even when we did start experiencing things. Often a group of us would be hanging out, watching a movie or something when this would happen. The first time we all sat there, gradually it dawned on me I could hear something. A perfectly natural sound. Someone was in the kitchen, clearing dishes away. I could see reflected in the conservatory window, someone moving back and forward in the kitchen. I looked left and right, doing a head count, and felt my blood drain. I turned to my buddy and said quietly, "Who the hell's in the kitchen?" Still looking at the TV, he said, "Oh, it's, quick head count. I don't know." The rest of the group had begun to catch on. They saw it too. We armed ourselves with anything we could find, golf clubs, chairs, guitars. Half of us took the hallway entrance, and the other conservatory entrance. As soon as someone could see directly into the kitchen, the noise straight up stopped, the clattering right up until the very last moment. None of us slept that night. However, it happened again and again. We purposefully took people who had never been there and knew nothing about it, and waited for them to notice, and it was always the same without fail. Sometimes when we all decided to crash for the night, the only place left was the spare room. I went up, opened the door, and some big guy had beat me to it, right there all wrapped up in the quilt. I went back downstairs with a sigh. My buddy asked me what was up and I explained. He's adamant no one is in there, pointing out where everyone is sleeping. I agree, but I'm also adamant someone is there. We both go up, open the door, and the quilt is flat and hanging off the bed. The second time it happens, I was with my girlfriend. She never set foot in that room again, but it wasn't just us that saw that one either. One night, one of my pals was taking his sweet time in the toilet. I decided to use the one upstairs. I walked up the stairs. I was looking down slightly. The top step came into view. It was dark, but nothing like pitch black, and there on top of the steps were legs, a black suit trouser, and a pair of polished black shoes. I tried with all my might to look up, but I just couldn't do it, and I went back down the stairs. One night it was Chris's birthday. He had a big party, loads of people, and the house was packed, blaring music, and at about 3 a.m, Chris takes me up to his room window. "Listen," he says. I run downstairs, grab my mate. He shuts off the music and everyone can hear it. Screams. 50-odd teenagers standing in the backyard and hanging out of a window in pure silence. I swear to you, I will not exaggerate. These were the most blood-curdling screams I've ever heard. It sounded like a woman or child, and it was coming from the forest. I tell myself it was probably a fox, but whatever was happening to that thing, I would not wish on anyone. It was crying in pain and it was loud. The sound would become higher pitched and pop, and then gurgling and then start all over again. Every single one of us stood there for about an hour. Girls started crying. Some of the guys were freaking out, and there was nothing else to do. We couldn't just keep partying with that going on. The sound was absolute suffering. Maybe you guys in the States have heard of things like that, with big predators over there. But the biggest predators we have here are foxes, and there was no commotion or barking or shouting, just the sound of this poor thing screaming and gurgling over and over like it was on a megaphone. In all my years of camping in Scotland, I've never heard anything like that. However, the woods were beautiful in the daytime. We would walk through them often. Every time without fail when we went through the woods during the day, high above us 2 crows would be flying in the sky, cawing and knocking each other. But there was some other strange stuff in there. There was an area with wooden joists that had been merged into a tree, like they had grown out of it. They had nails protruding over them and stained with viscous black liquid. Near there, where the branches from the tree separate, that were perfectly twisted together. Strange symbols carved into a tree. Once we found large piles of white hair at the base of these trees, a ring of a baby oak tree that had been cut down. The stump in the center seemed to be bloodstained. There was an area where many tall tree saplings had been bent over and secured to make arches tall enough for a man to walk through. We had the place mapped out well in our heads. We knew where to go from each landmark to find the others. The area was segmented by roads too, but at night, even if we followed the compass to a T, nothing was in the right place. Fair enough, it's dark, you can get turned around, but what really gives me the creeps is that at night, and only at night, about 15 feet northeast from the ring of the tree stumps was a huge U-shaped hedge about 15 feet high. The U-shaped hedge created a corridor about 30 feet long with a dead end. It was monolithic, but we could only ever find it at night. Chris had a small den that he built when he was a kid. We hung out there a few hours one day, just chatting and stuff, and then went back. The next day we returned to the den, and there was a perfect 3-foot wide black circle enscorched in the grass around the den. It was summer. The grass was tall, thick, and dry. I don't know how someone managed to do that. I think our constant investigating was annoying someone. We took it as a warning, but we didn't stop. After that, we weren't going so much, and in smaller groups, but I don't remember much else happening after that. This next story is from one of Chris's other group of friends that I heard before going to his house. So Chris had another group of friends who refused to go back to the house. Me and my best buddy knew one of them well, Darren. He was a really happy-go-lucky, really funny and cared about people An honestly great guy. They had similar experiences as we did, except these two. Not sure what order they happened in, so I'll start with what happened to Darren. We had been told that Darren would not talk about this. He would not say a word about it, having heard the story. I get that. So me and my buddy sat there with Darren in a pub in Glasgow city centre. It was a chance meeting, but since he'd had a few drinks I thought it would be worth asking. I said, "Dude, Crystal's house, what happened?" He stiffened up and I said, "I heard you won't talk about it. Can you just confirm what we've heard, even if it's just with a nod?" He nodded and confirmed the whole story that way, and I'll just tell you as I've been told it. He was sitting in the conservatory. It was a nice day, bright and sunny, and Darren was sitting alone. He had his headphones on listening to music when something caught his eye from his peripheral vision. He turned to look. Standing at the conservatory door was a woman draped in a black robe. She had long, straight blonde hair. Her eyes were wide and she was staring right at him. She brought her hand up and started tapping the glass frantically with her fingernail, all the time staring wide-eyed right at him. Darren freaked, got up from the couch, looked back, and the woman had moved back, but in the same position, still staring, but now just tapping at the air. He moved to the end of the couch, looked back, and she was further back, doing the same thing. He got to the kitchen door. She's back further, doing the same thing. He ran into the house, one last look back, and she's still on the other side of the fence. Still staring, still pointing. Darren didn't stop running. He ran upstairs into the bathroom, lifted the toilet seat and started smacking it on his head. His friends heard and pulled him away and calmed him down. After he confirmed a bit about the toilet, I asked him why. He said he just didn't know. One day they all decided to trek down into the woods. I think the group was about 8 strong, if not 7. Maybe one stayed behind. Anyway, Adam waited about 5 minutes after the rest set off because he wanted to freak them out. Adam had army experience. He was tall, 6'5". I knew him pretty well. He was cocky, funny, and confident. He told Crystal what he was doing and set off. About 2 hours went by and the rest of the group came back. Crystal asked, "Where's Adam?" You guys guess what happened next. They all went back in search of Adam. It was getting dark. They split up but stayed in earshot of each other. As they tell it, they searched for hours in the night. They met the edge of the woods, very upset at this point, losing hope. One of them shouted, "For God's sake, if you're there, make a noise. Do something." Right there and then, they hear a thump. They follow the sound, and only about 5 feet away, there he is, on the ground, leaning against a log, groggy. They grab him up, drag him back to the house all the way, and he's just slurring, "Witches, they got me, they got me." He had blood and a wound directly on top of his head. Blood was covering his face. He was close to delirious, so what they managed to get out of him was this. He ran down after them. He used his army training to sneak up on them. He was watching them from behind a tree. Then wham! He's on the ground leaning against a log. 3 women in white robes with blonde hair are staring in front of him. They tell him he shouldn't be there, and if he keeps coming it will be dangerous. The next thing he knows, his friends are shouting, asking him to make a noise. He groggily grabs a branch and starts hitting the log he's leaning on. He swears he follows them quite far into the woods, and the fact they found him where they did makes no sense. I spoke to him a lot about this. He was the most willing to talk and strangely the least bothered about the whole thing. He was also the only one in that group who wanted to go back, but that seemed to be the last straw for the rest of them. This is one more thing I almost forgot, that Chris told me about. Him and a mutual friend called Taryn went into the woods one day. They went to the den. They said it was a nice day until they started to head back. They heard a whistling noise. It got louder and louder, and they walked and walked until they were sure they'd left the woods. Then they began to panic. They started to run. The whistling started coming from in front of them, and they changed direction and ran. Taryn said the woods became a blur. They ran another way, and no matter which way they ran, the whistling was in front of them. Eventually, on the point of exhaustion, they fell out of the woods onto the road that led home. Taryn said it was the scariest experience of his life. He felt like they would never escape, and said he kept trying to slow down and be calm, but he just knew they had to run. Since I can remember, my mum saw things that no one else could, and knew things she couldn't ever have known. I'm not sure if I could call her a medium. To my knowledge, she's never actually tried to communicate with the dead. My mum never really liked to talk about it, and whenever I tried to talk about these things, she would quickly change the subject. However, she did tell me the spirits she sees or senses are all around us and are mostly neutral. The few instances of an evil presence she encountered scared her so much, she hoped that none of her children would have the same ability. I'm definitely not as sensitive as my mother. However, I do have a few strange experiences of my own. Today, I would like to share them with you. At the time I was around 15 years old. I live in Poland with my parents and 2 younger siblings in an apartment on the 4th floor. There was this older lady with some kind of mental disability living in the neighborhood. I never saw her before that day. She probably seldom left the house. That afternoon I was doing my hair in the bathroom when I heard noises coming from the apartment door. Someone was trying to get inside, knocking and pulling on the door handle. My stepdad and my siblings were at home with me, but my mom was out for some reason. I now do not remember. Thinking it may be her though, I opened the door. The moment I did, I saw an old, wrinkled lady with foggy eyes and grey hair try to push past me into the apartment. At that moment, I thought I saw a ghost. I stopped her by blocking the way with my body and asked how I could help her. She was visibly shaken, and her adult diaper was pulled down around her ankles. She began crying and yelling that her son is trying to kill her because she didn't want to give him money for alcohol. She said he grabbed her by the neck and attempted to strangle her. I looked over her shoulder, but I did not see anyone chasing her. As this was a bizarre situation, I really didn't know what to do, so I called out to my stepdad. He walked the old lady back home and told me later she's bipolar or something akin, and that she was probably just confused. I'm not sure what to do about it, as her son was indeed an alcoholic and the situation did not seem too implausible. My mum later told me the lady would sometimes come to our apartment thinking it was her place, as she lived in the neighbouring apartment block also on the 4th floor, but I never saw her again. Fast forward 2 years or so, I'm taking a shower, and suddenly I get this very weird sensation. I remember randomly the foggy-eyed old lady, and I knew that she had passed. As I got out the shower, the strange feeling lingered, and then all the toiletries and cosmetics began falling off the shelves. What was really weird is that some just fell straight down to the ground, and some flew in different directions. If someone asked me before this incident what I would do if I saw things moving on their own, I probably would have said I would have noped out of there in a second and never come back. But I was not scared. I started calmly picking up everything and putting it back in place, and as I exited the bathroom, my mum entered the apartment with bags full of groceries. "Mum," I said, following her into the kitchen, "you'll probably think there's something wrong with me, but do you remember the old lady with glaucoma who came over here once yelling that her son was trying to kill her?" "Yeah, I do," she responded while unpacking the bags. "I think she just died," I said. My mum then turned towards me. "I don't think there's anything wrong with you." She paused for a moment, then continued. "There was a fire in the neighborhood as I was coming back from the supermarket. The firefighters were taking out the lady's body from the apartment. She probably fell asleep smoking or something and started the fire. Her son wasn't home. I looked at her with my mouth open without saying a word. Her eyes turned from my face to something behind me and back to me, and then she calmly added, "Don't be scared. She's here." About 8 years ago, when I was a senior in high school, me and two of my very close friends decided to break into this house that was down a back road that we passed every day to go to one of their houses after school. The house was kept up, but no one had lived there in over 10 years at the time. And by kept up, I mean the lawn was mown and the lights were always on. It was pretty well known in the community that no one lived there, but the bills were paid by someone, and no one had lived there in years. So being teenagers, we decided to check it out after dark. There was a driveway that led to a covered garage in the back of the property that couldn't be seen from the road. We pulled in just after 11 p.m. and made our way back to the garage, and we parked. The entrance was clear, and there wasn't a soul around. Since the garage was behind the house, we made our way to the back entrance of the house and noticed there was a plywood slab that covered the back door's windowed top half. We proceeded to pry the cover off the door and revealed that the windows had been broken before, probably by another group of teens in the past, and we had our entrance. Once we climbed through, each helping the last through the window and into what was the kitchen at the back of the house. Once in the kitchen, we moved to the eerily tidy living room of the house, which was sort of infamous for being the room in the house with the lights on. There were magazines all dated to 1998, stacked neatly on the table in the middle of the room, and it was fairly clear that an elderly woman had once been the occupant. There was a sewing station and decor to suggest this. We felt safe at this point. We had made it in there, and there weren't neighbors or anything for half a mile in either direction. We sat around for about a half hour, freestyle rapping, laughing and smoking a joint. We toured the rest of the house and ended up back in the living room. It was overall pretty creepy, but pretty typical too. Just seemed like a normal household that hadn't been changed in 15 years. This is where it gets weird. We were still cutting up in the living room, and had actually turned the lights off because we were filming each other with my Lenovo laptop, something we did for fun all the time back then, so we could relive it and show our friends that we had braved the empty house on the back road. When all of a sudden, there was a sound like an old guttural truck trying its hardest to stay idling. The uneven rumble of an engine. It's hard to explain. I personally thought for a split second it was the air unit's fan outside the living room wall, or something along those lines. We froze in place and looked around at each other in the dark. Terrified faces stared back at me, illuminated by the glow of the laptop. After 10 seconds of the rumble, there was a squeak, and a heavy truck door slammed shut right outside the living room wall. Now we scrambled. No hesitation, we bolted for the front door that also connected to the living room, because climbing through that back door window would have been difficult in a panic, but the front door had actually been nailed shut. So we turned and ran to the other side of the house, in the back bedroom that was also on the back side of the house. We all three froze and didn't move a muscle. The engine rumble wasn't audible anymore, but we were trapped like mice. There were huge bushes covering every window, and the front door was nailed shut. The only way out was the way we had come in, but we were literally scared motionless. We sat in the bedroom waiting for the police or owner or someone to call out that our fun is over and to come out, but that never happened. There was a window to the backyard in our hiding spot, covered by a huge bush. I personally was directly next to it. my buddies very close to me, almost huddled around me. They could see and hear everything, and let me remind you that after the slam of the truck door, it was absolutely silent inside and out, besides us scrambling to the back. All of a sudden, chills go up my arm and back, and I slowly turn my head to my friends, who looked like they were about to keel over from fright. Footsteps in crunching leaves were coming, slowly, directly to the window that we were hiding behind. They stopped as close as they could, without walking directly into the bush, and we froze again. The footsteps we heard approaching the window were undoubtedly bipedal. After the steps stopped outside the window, we were immobilized with fear for nearly a minute, maybe more. We sat there waiting for the steps to depart or someone to call out at us, which never happened. The steps stopped outside the window and never moved. Only then did we silently agree. It was time to back out the room slowly, as we were horrified by what exactly could be staring towards us in this window. And at that moment we threw caution to the wind. We got up, slowly backpedaled away from the window and made our way into the hallway outside the room, and into the area before the kitchen where our exit was now back in sight. I think all three of us knew that something was very wrong about all of this, and I think getting caught by the police or the owner wasn't on any of our minds. This was very surreal and felt almost like a prank, because there's no way people of authority would be haunting us in the way whoever was outside had been doing. So fed up of what felt like an eternity of unease and terror, we decided to bolt to the window in the door in the kitchen all at once and go out together, to either face what had been tormenting us or run. Once we were outside, we counted down from 3 and ran past the huge bushes to the left where our stalker had been. I couldn't help it. I had to turn around and look. I turned, and all I saw were the lights beaming from the window broken up by the bush and illuminating a patch of ground covered in what appeared to be undisturbed leaves. This made my whole body crawl in a way I've never felt before or honestly after. We made it to my car in the garage, and I backed out and tore away as fast as I ever had. There was no vehicle outside. There wasn't anything. There was a deafening silence and stillness. We are still very uneasy talking about it to this day. Even writing this makes my eyes water and my skin crawl. I've always been a man of science and a huge skeptic, but I can't explain that night. There was something so wrong about everything. Needless to say, we never went back. The first story I'm going to tell you is a story relayed to me by my late father, and it was something that happened to him and my eldest half-sister when she was a teenager. Allow me to give you some background. My half-sister Giselle had always been able to see ghosts since she was a child, and being able to do so has made her feel like she was cursed, especially since the entity she sees always appears solid and showed up unexpectedly during the most unexpected of times. My oldest sister Isabel seems to share that curse, since she experiences the same thing. I, however, can only see shadows from the corner of my eye, as well as feel others' presences when I'm alone. And yet I look, but no one's there. I just pray that I never encounter a ghost up front like my older sisters have. At the time of this event, Giselle was 14 years old, and accompanying my father one weekend as she was scouting for a new house to move into, since Giselle's mother was pregnant with her 6th child, and things were getting cramped in their current residence. My father noticed that Giselle had been clinging to his arm very tightly ever since they entered the front gate, and had been glancing around with clear unease. According to my father, the house was a 2-story house, comfy looking and quite spacious, only with a few repairs needed in a room or two. And the price the owner was giving him was much lower than he had expected it to be. However, my father couldn't shake off the feeling he had as soon as my sister entered the house. The atmosphere felt heavy and so wrong. Add to the fact that Gazelle had seemed reluctant to enter the house and was no longer looking around, but constantly turned to look over her shoulder. As the tour of the house progressed, my father saw that Giselle's unease had melted into complete and utter terror, her face extremely pale, that he thought at one point she was going to faint, and she practically had his arm in a death grip. Giselle, however, refused to say a word when he asked what was wrong, just shaking her head and practically gluing herself to his side as she trembled. My father knew just by the terrified look on Giselle's face that buying that house would be a mistake. Once the tour was over, my father informed the owner that they wouldn't be buying the house, as tempting as the low price was, but thanked him for his time. When my father and Giselle were in the car, he noticed how her eyes were fixed on one of the windows on the second floor, and because he knew that she could see something he couldn't, he asked her what was wrong. My sister tore her dark eyes away from whatever she had been looking at, before turning to him still terrified. "Dad?" Her normally high-pitched voice was barely a whisper. "There was a woman in black following us around while we were going through the house. She was floating, and she had a black veil over her head, but I could see her face. It was white, so white, and her eyes, they were pure black, but at the same time, blazing with hatred. And she had a snarl on her face and followed us at a distance, but stopped at the foyer after you and I stepped out the door. She was watching us from one of the windows on the second floor just now. She was just filled with hate." My father had started driving as Giselle spoke, and he felt a chill run down his spine once she finished. They didn't bother looking at any other houses that day, despite my father having listed 4 more to look at, because he told me that what Giselle had told him rattled him more than he wanted to admit, and he felt quite drained. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if they'd have bought that house. The next story was told to me by my parents and takes place in a building that my parents and I were residing in shortly after I was born. It seems the building was quite haunted, and they had only learnt about it after moving in. All the people residing there had their own stories to tell. It was just before lunch on the day my parents brought me back from the hospital, and I was asleep in my mother's arms. Just as soon as my parents stepped in their flat and were about to insert the key into the lock, they were startled when something collided with the door, barely missing my father's head. The noise jolted me from my sleep and I began to wail. They whipped their head towards the winding staircase that led to the upper floors, and my father ran to the foot of the stairs to see who had thrown the dirt, but there was no one about, and they would have heard someone running on the tiled floor, or any of the doors slamming, but it was completely silent since it was a weekday and the neighbors were at work. After ushering my mother inside, my father took a look at what had nearly struck him, and saw it was a ball of dirt, compacted perfectly into shapes, as if someone had taken the time to form it and harden it with their hand before hurling it in his direction. My father took a gardening trowel and scooped it up, before showing it to my mother, who was trying to comfort me since I was still crying up a storm. When the neighbors arrived from work several hours later, they saw my father standing at the foot of the stairs looking up. They asked what was wrong, and he proceeded to tell them the events of the day and showed them the ball of dirt that had caused the fuss. Little things would happen as the months went by. Some that were harmless, others not so. Sometimes when my father was at work, and my mother was carrying me as she moved about the house, she noticed how I kept shifting in her arms and laughing, as if there was someone playing peekaboo with me, even though she knew that we were the only ones there. Other times she would hear me squealing with delight in my crib when she had her back to me, and when she turned around, I would be reaching into the air as if trying to grab something. One night, while both my parents were laying in bed, gazing at me as I slept between them. They heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking into the bedroom and stopped outside the door. They heard the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling, as if someone was trying to get in but the door was locked. The rattling stopped, only to be followed by a light knocking. My father turned on the bedroom light, demanding to know who it was. The knocking stopped and there was only silence. Nothing else happened that night. However, neither of my parents got any sleep. The next morning they checked all the doors and windows, and everything was locked. We moved out of that place that same weekend. I've never seen shadow people from my peripheral vision. They're always a few feet away from me, but right in front of my field of vision. I've only ever seen them at night, when my room is quite dark. Generally something rouses me in my sleep. I'll open my eyes, and there it is, a dark, humanoid figure, which I always initially assume is a family member out of bed and trying to awake me for some reason. I'll then ask them what they're doing or why they awoke me. But when they say nothing and remain still, I'll grow annoyed and continue repeating my questions until they just gradually dissolve before my very eyes. This is the moment where the fear sinks in, and I realize this clearly wasn't the family member I thought I was just aggressively speaking to. My point here is that these dark humanoid figures are already present, so I don't see how they materialized in the first place. As I lay beneath my covers, I kept my eyes on the corner of my room at the foot of my bed. As I stared into the patch of darkness and shadow where the two walls met, I felt like my eyes were playing tricks on me, because it looked as if the shadow was undulating. I kept my eyes fixed to the space, and slowly but surely the shadow grew larger and morphed into this big, dark, round humanoid figure. I say rounded because it was kind of like a featureless, heavy-set Santa body made out of super dark shadow. I'd never seen anything like this before. He was wearing a hat. He had a kind of large sombrero and just stood there motionless once manifested, and seemed to be made completely from shadow, as though the thing just pulls in and sucks in a patch of deep shadow from a space in the room and uses that to form his space. It was a really trippy experience, and I was a kid and quite scared and remained stock still, staring in shock for at least 20 seconds, trying to gain the courage to scream out to my parents in the next room. I still remember counting to 3 in my head before I finally had the guts to scream, "Mom!" I closed my eyes while screaming, so this time I wasn't able to watch the thing depart or dissolve. My parents took mere seconds to enter my room, and once they were there, my eyes opened, and I looked straight back into the corner and the thing was gone. I never saw one like that again. The others are always quite skinny. One thing for sure though, each time I've had an encounter with a shadow person, even though I've now had quite a few, I'm always equally and unsuspecting at the time before, and I always feel the same initial frustration while not receiving a response, right up until that cold fear takes over upon their eerie and unexplainable departure. I am a 25-year-old and live in the UK. I've always believed in the paranormal and have had a few experiences in my life, and have been told by a medium that I am sensitive to it. This particular experience happened at my Aunt Claire's house when I was around 10. She used to live in a small 2-bedroom house in a town called Greenhill. Many things happened in this house in the few years that she lived there, and I can safely say I am so glad that she moved away from this awful, accursed home. It started out with small little things, like footsteps being heard when no one was moving around the house, and things moving by themselves, as well as shadows out of the corner of your eye. But things took a pretty sinister turn in the space of a week, when a few key events happened. The first scary thing that occurred was between myself and my aunt's two sons, Tyler and Seb. We spent a lot of time in the backyard playing in the mud and climbing trees, but on this particular day, we opted to dig a hole for some reason. I don't really remember why, but regardless, we dug at the dirt at the bottom of the garden. This garden was long and led to the forest and fields on the back of the house. It was cut off from them with an old rotten wooded fence. We chose to dig in the middle of the trees at a particularly muddy area, and as soon as we hit something hard, we decided to dig it out, assuming as children that it was some lost treasure we were unearthing and that we had hit the jackpot. Instead, as we dug, we found a skull. We screamed for my aunt and mum and showed them, and they looked at each other mumbling about being someone's old pet. But at the time I thought nothing of it, but would find out at the age of 18 it was the skull of a baby, and that my aunt never managed to find out any information on it even after taking it to the police. This would then start a chain of events that none of us foresaw. It happened on firework night, and myself, Seb, Tyler, Claire, my mum and dad and my aunt's boyfriend were chilling downstairs. All the kids bar myself were asleep, when we heard the sound of boots on the floor above us, which was impossible, as we were the only ones home and everyone was accounted for in the living room. My aunt shrugged it off and said that it must be pipes. A while later, I walked past the stairway to get into the kitchen, and from the corner of my eye, I saw something that resembled the large shadow of a man swinging from the ceiling of the landing. I stopped and let out a little shriek, and it was gone. My aunt asked me what I'd seen, and I told her, and she looked sick. I was later to learn that this is a regular occurrence. Along with the occurrence was one that I myself had witnessed when asleep in bed, when we had stayed over for the night, as we did often. Both the boys would be in bed, and you would hear children's laughter and running through the house. Later that night, scratching could be heard throughout the house, but could never be placed, as each time you thought you had pinned it, it would move to the opposite wall or area you were at. We were watching a film called Silence of the Lambs, which certainly didn't help the atmosphere. Great film, by the way. And halfway through the film, my dad left to get takeout, so the movie was paused as we all sat laughing and talking, when an almighty boom resounded through the house coming from upstairs. We all leaped upstairs, including my sleeping cousins, who awoke, startled and confused. We proceeded to follow my aunt's boyfriend upstairs to investigate, and on first glance nothing seemed to be amiss. All the doors were open, and nothing seemed to have fallen. This all changed when my aunt's son Tyler asked, "Mum, what's that?" pointing to something laying against the wall. My aunt bent to pick it up and almost threw it at my mum, gasping, "My God." I looked at my mum, who was holding a small white and pink laced baby shoe that had small dark patches on it. Everyone had gone as white as a ghost and looked startled. I should now say that my aunt had no girls at the time, and the boys were 9 and 6. This is when my mum looked up and shouted, "Claire, the attic's open. How the hell is it open?" When I tell you the attic's open, I don't just mean it was unsealed. See, in this house, in the attic, you'd need to push up and slide across to open it. And rarely do they have ladders, at least these houses don't. This particular attic wasn't just open, but the lid had been completely pushed up and moved to the inside of it. So the attic was now completely open, and you could see all the darkness above and the shininess of the plastic bin bags ahead. This was insane. As before my aunt had moved in, the attic had been checked and resealed, as the attic was completely empty and had new heat protection in there, so there should be no black bags in there. The reason the opening of the attic was also so terrifying is because the attic had been painted over and sealed with a special sealant to keep it and to stop any draft from coming through it. My aunt's boyfriend then retrieved the bag to find that it was a bag of baby clothes that had never been seen there before and did not belong to my aunt. We were all rushed downstairs, and a few hours later my dad and my aunt's boyfriend had a fire going and burnt the shoe and baby clothes. I still today don't know what was on the baby's shoe, and I have never wanted to ask for fear of an answer. The story does not end here though. After this event, the feeling in the house got worse and became a dark and scary place to stay. And you could feel as though you were being watched and would often feel someone breathe on your neck. My aunt only managed to cope for a year when she decided to move away and get out the house. 6 months after she left, there was a house fire there, and the man who lived there sadly passed away. But this got my aunt interested, and she looked into the history of the house and was horrified to discover upon researching that the house had a dark past, which had meant that every household had either lost one member or the family in its entirety who occupied it. This is where things started to make sense. The man who lived there before had had severe depression and ended his life on the landing light fixture. The family beforehand had lost members to carbon monoxide poisoning, and the family before that had lost a child and a family pet to a house fire. The record she found only went back so far, but there's still so much unknown about the house. We, however, believe that the house was cursed, and my aunt was lucky to have gotten out alive with her entire family. I know the house is still there, and my ex-fiancé lives not too far away from it, but I have no desire to go back and find out what happened to anyone else who lived there, and it was a really dark and scary time for me and my aunt. We've never looked back, and personally I avoid going anywhere near it. I'm a native of Long Island, New York, which, as you may know, has been settled for a long time and has a lot of little old towns, especially on the eastern end of the island. We even have some Revolutionary War history. At the time of this story, I was seeing a guy from the local area, and one night he took me to a bar called the Checkmate Inn in Setticat, because some friends of his worked there, and it was supposed to be this cool old local spot with a few interesting stories. It used to be a private home and sits on a barely lit single-lane road winding through rows of tall trees. It actually still looks like an old house, and even has a cellar where they store the alcohol. Its second story has been converted into some apartments above the bar area, and staff sometimes rent them out. Across the street from the Checkmate is the Thompson House, an old wooden structure built in 1709, belonging to a doctor during the Revolutionary War, and is now a museum of colonial medicine. We got there before the big rush of customers showed up, and we were able to talk with one of his buddies who tended the bar that evening. Somehow the subject of ghost stories came up. My date's buddy told me that he'd rented one of the upstairs apartments and had some weird experiences up there. There had been a few nights when he'd awoken at 3 a.m. to see a shadow standing on the opposite side of the bedroom, or being alone in the apartment at night and hearing footsteps passing through the other rooms, having glass beer bottles suddenly slide off the kitchen table and crash to the floor, or witnessing his bedroom curtains waving wildly as if blown by a strong wind, only to find that the windows were closed and locked. One night he woke up in the darkness to see an old man leaning over his bed, looking furiously angry. Thinking someone had broken in, he yelled at the man and sat up, but in that moment the man vanished. His brother had worked at the bar and rented one of the apartments before him as well, and reportedly saw not only the shadowy figure of an old man, but also what appeared to be a young woman in a pale dress in his bedroom at night. He never got a good look at her face though. Apparently the brother's girlfriend had stayed there with him overnight a few times, and had seen the woman as well. The bartender had worked at the Checkmate for about a year at that time, and while he no longer rented the apartment there, he continued to have strange things happen to him while on the job. The most active part of the building was the old cellar. He said it's very dark and cool down there, and several times he'd gone down to grab another keg of beer or bottles of liquor, and had bottles flung at him when he was the only one down there. He'd also been pushed on the stairs while carrying bottles once. His co-workers also told stories of having an uneasy feeling in the cellar, and having kegs rolled across the room suddenly, or having bottles thrown at them. When they went to confront whoever was on shift with them at the time, they were always in another part of the building and denied playing jokes. He wasn't sure about the history of the house or whether anyone had passed away there, though. The home is from the mid-1800s, so I'm not sure if it had many owners through the years. Well, I love ghost stories, and so did my date. We didn't find them so much scary as thought-provoking and entertaining. We enjoyed the rest of our night and went to leave at about 2:30 in the morning. Most of the patrons had left at that point, with just 2 or 3 stragglers hanging out on the back deck. We each had driven ourselves to the bar, and I had parked on the side of the road in front of the old Thompson house. We stood in front of the house talking for several minutes, and then shared a long kiss. Suddenly, both of us were startled by a very loud thump right next to us. We pulled apart, and I started looking around for what could have made the noise. A few feet away, rolling towards the road, was a huge rock, almost the size of a cantaloupe. I was trying to be brave and picked it up. It must have weighed 5 or 6 pounds. I was pissed, thinking one of his friends at the bar had thrown it at us as an incredibly mean and unfunny joke. No one was around, and as we had been standing around for a while, we would have seen anybody crossing the road. The Checkmate is set about 100 yards from the road, and then off to the side is the patio. If someone had thrown it from across the street, they'd have to have been a shot-put champ to hurl a 6-pound rock almost 200 yards. And even then, why was the rock bouncing quickly towards the road? None of the few remaining bar patrons had moved from their seats, and no one was up or moving around on the other side of the road. It looked as if it had been thrown from the direction of the dark woods surrounding the Thompson house. I walked around the property expecting to find someone hiding in the bushes, but I didn't see or hear anything. Neither of us had seen or heard anyone walking around. It was a still night on a quiet road, and unable to come up with an explanation, we were both pretty freaked out and decided that was our cue to leave. Something around there was clearly not happy with PDA. I'm no longer seeing the guy, as I haven't gone back there since. But one day when the COVID lockdown is over, I'd like to go back and see if any of the current bar staff have any new stories to tell. Besides, it's a fun local bar and a good spot for a low-key night out. Next story. I now live in Northern Virginia, and as it so happens, the Gettysburg battlefield is only about an hour-and-a-half drive away from where I currently reside. If you've ever heard the stories, the battlegrounds and the surrounding neighborhoods are supposed to be extremely haunted. They have some fantastic ghost tours there, and the town and battlefields have their own sort of aura about them. Even without hearing the stories, I went on a ghost tour one night with a friend of mine. At one point in the tour, we arrived at a creek on the edge of town. The story as told by our guide was that on the second day of the battle, a group of wounded Union soldiers had taken refuge in the creek bed, which was dry in the middle of summer. Many of them were badly injured and unable to move. Unfortunately, the summer storm came through and it began to rain heavily, flooding the creek bedding and drowning all of the wounded men. Not one of them survived, according to the tale. Well, it was nighttime when I stood there, and pitch black. I hung back as the tour group moved on to their next stop and looked around. There's a lot of long grasses and cattails growing along the creek now, and I decided just for the fun of it to take some pictures of them in the dark. I had flash on, and of course I made sure that there was no one in front of me or around me at the time. I really didn't expect anything, but figured why not. The next day, as I got home, I was looking through my tour photos, and in one of the pictures I had taken of the creek, you can see the reeds and cattails very clearly, lit up by the flash, floating above them, and the upper hand corner of the picture, dim but still very visible, was a face. It was the side view of a man's face, and you could easily make out a blue cap from the front of a blue-collared coat and yellow buttons. The forehead, eyes, nose, and parts of the chin, as well as what would appear to be dark hair under the cap, were very distinct. Remember again that this face is floating above the tall plants in the creek, and while not transparent, it does seem to be lit up by the flash. The two other photos I took of the same spot within seconds of each other had nothing on it. The blue military-looking coat and cap made me wonder if this could have been the apparition of a Union soldier, hanging around the spot where he'd tragically drowned. I showed the photo to a few people without pointing anything out to them, and every one of them immediately noticed the face. The third story here was told to me by a friend of mine who hails from Michigan. She was in a sorority during her undergrad years, and one of the sorority chapter houses had a ghostly legend attached to it. Apparently, a former sister had graduated and returned to the university years later as a professor. I'm not sure of the details, but her life was brutally ended in her home one night, and I don't think the killer was ever caught. Since then, the sorority house, where she had spent so much of her time of her life in, has been the site of disembodied footsteps, doors opening and closing, lamps turning on and off by themselves, and generally only when one of the sisters was alone in the house at night. She claims that many of the sisters she knew had experiences like this. One day, a visitor of one of the sorority's national councils came for a visit and stayed at the house. Not being from the local area, she decided to do some sightseeing in a nearby city and brought her GPS with her. This was several years ago, before everyone had a GPS on their phones. She had kept the GPS in her room at the sorority house that day and used it to navigate the city. On her way in, she experienced no problems and found her destination without difficulty. On her way home later that night, she plugged in the address to the house and soon noticed that her return route bore no resemblance to the one she'd taken earlier in the day. After many unfamiliar twists and turns, the GPS told her that she had arrived at her destination. The problem was she had not arrived at the sorority house, but a cemetery. After messing around with the device and re-entering the address, she finally found her way back to the sorority house and explained to one of the hosts what had transpired. Upon revealing the name of the cemetery, she was informed that it just so happened to be the one that the murdered former sister was buried in. "20 years ago, I was sleeping beside my husband, and I woke up. As I was turning over, I look over at my husband's shoulder and saw a woman standing in the bedroom doorway staring at my husband intently with curiosity. She then began moving towards him. She had no idea I was watching her. When she began walking towards him, I got angry, and I was going to launch myself over him and tackle her, but she was too far away. I was concerned I would wake my husband, and he would get up suddenly, causing me to hurt him. Instead, I turned over, got out of bed, and went around. But by the time I got to the end of the bed, she was gone. This was no common intruder. She was approximately 5 feet tall, very slim, but with a definite female figure, around 100 pounds. She was not clothed, but looked like a solid silhouette, or as if head to toe in a skin-tight black bodysuit. She did not have hair on her silhouette. Why can I describe her so well? She was less than 12 feet away from me, and this was not the first time seeing the paranormal, so no shock or fear. But although I did not mind paranormal encounters, I do not let them come near my husband. Can anyone give any hints as to what she was? She seemed solid. I could not see through her or any details in the hall. She was darker than the surrounding night, but it might have been the moonlight, and we have skylights in the living room downstairs. When she realized I saw her, she stopped and felt surprised. I have also found info on shadow men, but this is a woman, not a shadow, and not sinister. Does anyone know what this could possibly have been? I've got an interesting story I would like to share with you. So, family from my mother's side have been having some strange events happen to them. My maternal grandfather talked about his mum and dad standing around him 3 days before he passed, and the day he did die, he told my aunt that his parents were in the room and telling him that he would be joining them at 2:30 that night. He breathed his last that hour. My maternal uncle woke up suddenly in the dead of night, and his wife asked him where did he think he was going at 3 in the morning. He replied that his mother was outside asking him to come over to her. He died within 20 minutes. My late mother asked me once who was the third person besides you and your father as you were talking to me. I replied no one. Later she said her parents were there saying that she would be with them shortly and that they would have to come and take her. Sometime later she named a few more folks standing around her and passed away shortly after. But the strangest of all these occurrences is that of a 28-year-old man, the son of a very close family friend of my parents-in-law. It baffles me to this day. He was visiting his parents on leave from Moscow, where he was stationed as part of a MNC staff. His younger sister was getting married and the house was packed with guests. He woke up at 12:30 at night, was a bit panicky. His Russian wife called in his elder brother, who found his youngest brother crying in a state of panic. The younger man asked for his mother, and once she arrived, asked for her to stay with him, since they would arrive at 4 in the morning to take him. The guy was clean, had always been drug-free. His older brother suggested they visit a hospital and let them run whatever tests they need to. Maybe he was suffering from something, and perhaps it was just a nightmare, but he agreed and insisted that his mother came along. They brought him to a nearby facility. The ER docs and nurses were skeptical, but they ran the tests anyway. Alcohol, drugs, EKG, and a few others, all normal. They told him that he was as fit as a fiddle and could proceed home. However, the young man was still panicky, and at the insistence of the family, the hospital agreed to detain him until morning. A few minutes before 4 a.m. he said, "They have arrived. They are tall, many of them in white robes. Their faces are covered and they are angels. They are all surrounding my bed and the room is full of them." At precisely 4 a.m. he went limp, ceased breathing, and was declared dead. Back in the 80s, I was in college and lived in a dorm room. I never owned a Ouija board, but if someone had one, then I'd either watch or participate. To be honest, this was one of the first times I ever used it. I had a question for the board. My grandmother had my father when she was young and single. That was a big deal back in the 1930s. When she found out she was pregnant, she ran away from home, dropped my father off at her parents' house when he was 6 months old and left, coming to visit less and less frequently. By the time he was 5, she'd never come back at all and vanished. So my father was raised by an aunt, never really knew his mother, and didn't have any idea who his father was. By the time he was in his 40s, he wanted to find her. Lots of dead ends, but he eventually did. Anyway, that night I asked the board if my grandmother was alive. The board said yes, and I asked if she lived in my home state. The board said yes. I asked if she lived in my hometown. The board said yes. I asked what street she lived on, and the board spelled out the name of the street, Washington Street. At the time, I wasn't sure if there was a Washington Street in my hometown, but it turns out there was. No, Grandma didn't live there, but 2 years later, my father found his mum. She lived in my home state, in the town of Washington. It wasn't the street's name, it was the town's name. How messed up is that? More than 30 years later, I still have no explanation. Having so much history myself with the paranormal, I don't freak out over creaks in the floor or the occasional door shutting on its own. I believe most things can be explained. When we first moved into this house in Washington 3 years ago, we saw a few random orbs here and there. Nothing that felt harmful. In fact, one orb even danced to the music alongside my granddaughter one day, and it felt like a child. The house sits on acres of field, surrounded by forest and a few farms. For some reason, the guest room, laundry room and bathroom are always freezing cold, plus cool air comes from the guest bedroom closet. I keep a blanket hanging up in the hallway door to keep the cold isolated. I figure those rooms are just cold because they are added on and are built halfway over our well. I have my mother's ashes in my home, but at the same time I felt bad because when I was asked if I wanted my sister's ashes later, it scared me for some reason. I don't know why. She was a very loving person, but for many years I felt darkness around her, and I just couldn't. A year passed, and that fear left me. I remember her telling me one day before she died that she had a recurring dream of her death, and she was stuck in the desert. It then dawned on me that her ashes were being cared for by my daughter who lives in the desert. It was time to let her be here with Mum. After she arrived, her ashes were placed next to our mother's ashes outside my room, and like my mother, she was surrounded by some of her mementos. At first, there wasn't a problem, but after time, that's when the kids started seeing and experiencing things that made them feel uncomfortable. It didn't feel like my sister. This was something else. Strangely, absolutely no one in the family has felt her presence since she passed. I know my kids looked towards me for assurance. I guess they thought that, like in other homes, I could just make it all go away. But I think they stayed hidden from me in the beginning and preyed on those who showed fear. So it was targeting my grown kids, that being my son and his fiancée. I felt bad. I kept telling my son that there was nothing here and that our house wasn't haunted because we cleansed it after my sister passed away. Cody, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry for not wanting to believe you at the time. I was just trying to protect you and the kids from being scared. So there are a few things that have been happening in our home for the past few years. One late afternoon I was at the store, so my son and his fiancée were watching my 2 grandchildren for me. They were playing hide and seek. They told me something wasn't right in there. Each of them experienced what they said felt like someone or something taking up space within them in the closet, practically in their face. It had been a toy room in the beginning, but the kids wouldn't play in there. The only person who has ever slept there with no problem is my ex on a visit. He was a non-believer, until just the day when we were sitting in there watching a show together, and we observed his dog intently follow something move around the room. Then the bathroom door opened, and his dog watched whatever it was going to the bathroom, and the door shut behind it. At that point, his dog dove under the blanket. My ex's eyes were as big as saucers, and he asked me if I saw what he saw. Laughing inside at the former non-believer, I said yes. No one will ever sleep in there, not even me. 6 months ago, my son told me that he went into the kitchen to grab something to drink the night before, and he saw a dark shadow over his left shoulder in his reflection on the microwave. He turned around quickly to look behind him, and there was nothing there. He still felt something close to him, and the hair on his arm and neck were raised. So when he looked into his reflection this time in the window over the sink, and again, it was back, with its head even closer to his. Then the cabinet door shook back and forth, then opened all the way and shut. He said that he yelled, not caring if he woke anyone up, and ran upstairs to his room. I don't blame him. Many times he and his fiancée have seen big shadow masses in corners of various rooms, but never in my bedroom. Waiting outside my door, where my sister's ashes are, but never inside my room. There was a time not too long ago they were both sitting in my van talking one night, and they said the form of a man came out from behind a tree, crossed the grass, and sat with his hands in his lap on the front porch, and then faded away. Then they told me about the bathroom. Oh my, that bathroom. I can't even. His fiancée was taking a bath after everyone had gone to sleep, as to not disturb anyone. She was relaxing in our big old claw bathtub in the quiet of night, and she heard all of us sleeping, so she knew for a fact no one was up. There was a tapping on the bathroom door and she answered, to no response. The doorknob started to jiggle, then stopped, so she asked again, "Who is it? I'm in the tub." There was still no response. She thought that whoever it was decided to go to the other bathroom, so she relaxed, and she was laying there. But then something felt off, as she heard a noise at the door, and she watched as the doorknob slowly unlocked itself. When she told me that, my blood ran cold. This didn't just happen once. My son was sitting in there and he heard tapping, followed by the door unlocking on him too. The other day, my son said that he had gone to the bathroom around 3 in the morning. He knew everyone was asleep because he heard all of us snoring, so he didn't quite shut the door all the way, but it was closed. He heard heavy breathing as if someone had their mouth at the crack of the door. Then he heard a quiet voice whisper, "I can hear you." That poor boy was scared to death. I, for the first time, experienced the doorknob unlocking itself on me 3 times in a row in my bathroom last night. That surprised me. It has not always been bad experiences here, though. Since my mother passed, I feel her sometimes around me. We all do. Just last month, I was talking to my son in the living room, and I saw a light. We don't live near a street, so it wasn't from a car. It was soft and illuminating, as it floated from the front window curtain around to the wall behind my son. I got such a warm feeling and said, "Hey, Mama," and watched it as it went behind the recliner, where my son was sitting, and then up behind his head and disappeared. He didn't see this or know why I said that. Just then he shrugged his shoulders up and put his hands on the back of his head, saying that it felt like his hair was being stroked. That brought tears to both of us. We all know when she is here because it feels warm and loving, like her, and sometimes we smell her sweet perfume. My grandson, who is autistic, was too young to comprehend my mother's passing. He sometimes talks to her, almost like he is answering what seems to be a question. He is only 6 and has the purest soul. I wish I could hear her voice speak to me again. And then you have things that happen that at the time you didn't understand, but when you find out, everything falls into place. This was one such time. In March, I had a few aluminium balloons left over from my grandson's birthday, and they lasted a very long time. All of them fell to the floor except one particular balloon. It kept following me midway in the air around the house. The air conditioner nor heater was on, and all the windows were shut. I went to my bedroom and it followed and stayed in my bed. I went into the laundry room and it followed there as well. This went on for a solid week after a while. It just started getting annoying, but we didn't think anything of it. We just swatted it away. One day my son and I were talking in the kitchen, and it came in from the living room where we just saw it laying on the floor moments before and lowered itself to go under the door frame and stopped mid-height between us. He took it and pushed it back into the living room. Not 4 minutes later and it was back mid-height between us. This time he put it all the way in the laundry room and it still made its way back, lowering to come through 2 door frames and staying afloat midway between us again. At that point it was too weird. We both looked at each other and said, "Nah." So I took it and said, okay, if this is you, Mum, do it again. I put it back in the living room and it stayed there floating. It didn't feel like her at the moment. It felt different, almost familiar, but not in a bad way. We went back to talking, and there it was again between us. Well, I didn't know this at the time. In fact, I only just found out a few weeks ago that my dear friend passed away in March and his family didn't have my number to tell me. One of the last things he told me was that when he dies he was going to come harass me just for fun and let me know that he's here and he loves me. When I found out, I called out to my son saying, "It was Tom! It was Tom after all." After I told him the sad news, he said that it gave him a bit of peace. We all knew that this is something he would do, and it blew our minds. I just wish I found out then, so that I could have told him that I love him too. 3 nights ago, I saw a light low to the ground in the kitchen, and 5 minutes later my granddaughter saw the same light, formed like a feather, fluttering in front of her. My son also told me that a light trailed up over and across in his room. Another time he walked into my room and saw a light above my head. My neighbor is confident something happened on this land. I talked to him to see if he had been experiencing or seeing anything unusual, without making myself look crazy. He said that he does not go out after dark, but he has heard the screams in the forest and his pets acting strangely from time to time. As we were talking, his roommate came home and asked me what we were talking about. When I told him, he pointed to the young man I was talking to first and said, "You see, I'm not nuts." Apparently, he had seen things as well and calls what he sees in his bedroom a demon boy, because he doesn't know what it is. He even saged in this room, and if you think about it, that goes along with the orb that danced with my granddaughter when we first moved in. And no, it's not a demon. I think that perhaps it's a child that connected or roams the property. We have seen so many beautiful things here that it outweighs the bad. Someday after I'm gone, I hope to be a part of it. I want to be the whisper of encouragement in my loved one's ears and a gentle stroke upon their face. I want them to always know that they don't have to be afraid, and that they are, and always will be loved, from now until forever. As for what is in this house, I think since I have been more aware of the darkness, it shows itself less. I do enjoy feeling my loved ones around though, and my kids do too. Someday we will move from this place, and hopefully one of our loved ones will follow. Today, when I arrived home after running errands, my ex told me that without a doubt he saw something. At first I told him to stop playing around because I thought he was making fun of us. I've known this man for 24 years, so I know when he's serious. And this time he was definitely shaken. He said that he was standing in the guest room, and he was about to go into the bathroom to wash his hands, when someone tall, who he thought was my son, turned on the light and darted into the bathroom really fast, closing the door behind him. He waited for a bit, but didn't hear anything. He got tired of waiting, washed his hands in the kitchen, and still hadn't heard anything for a while. So we went to the door and asked if my son was okay, to not receive an answer, but the light was still on. He tentatively pushed open the door, to find nothing. Confused, he went to my son's room and knocked, and asked him why he did that and left the light on. But when my son came out of his room, he was wearing a burgundy shirt and pants. With a shake in his voice, my ex asked if he had changed his clothes, to which my son responds, "No, why?" The person my ex saw was wearing a blue t-shirt and shorts. My son told me that when he opened the door, my ex turned pale. On another occasion, my son's fiancée was in the kitchen today, and we are all putting away groceries. She has mid-length hair, and in front of everyone her hair flipped up like someone tossed it. It freaked her out and she said it gave her shivers. I promised my other son I would come help paint his new place, so I bathed my grandkids and made them something to eat. I figured I would only be gone a few hours, but it took way longer than expected. When I arrived, there were all kinds of commotions going on in my room, and my grandson was crying uncontrollably. No one could understand him because he was so upset, so he was trying to act out what just happened. After I calmed him down, he told me that he was getting tired and laid down. He said something woke him up, and he heard my car, so he went towards the bedroom door, when a dark hole formed at the top, outside my door, and a dark shadow boy thing came out of it. He said the boy stood in the doorway and pushed him back and slammed the baby gate, trapping him in the room. He said it was evil. He kept saying that over and over, "He's evil." After the gate shut, my grandson screamed, so everyone in the house ran to see what was wrong. I know kids have active imaginations, but I know him. He's autistic, and he doesn't lie or make things up. He was visibly shaken up, and since last night, his story hasn't changed. I had a school trip to the concentration camps in Germany and Austria. I remember arriving at the first camp on our itinerary, Dachau. When we got off the bus, they told us to get the banners, flags, and flowers and to put them at the front as a memorial. I got the peace flag. It was a rainbow flag with a big peace sign on it. When we were in front of the gate, I remember feeling incredibly overwhelmed and being stared at. It was a creepy feeling, but I didn't mind it. As we walked through the gate, the first thing I saw was the window on the barrack I had in front of me. I saw a bald, beaten-up man in the prisoner's blue and white uniform. We stared at each other for at least 5 seconds, and he looked at the flag I was holding. I blinked, and the man wasn't there anymore. I didn't really mind it, because I believe in the supernatural, and I expected that to happen. The tour guide afterwards gave us a device to put on our ear for us to hear him better. As he was speaking, telling us about his father's experience, as he was a child of an ex-prisoner there, my ear device started having problems. I started hearing only static sounds, so I decided to remove it, but before I was able to do this, I heard a man's voice saying words I couldn't understand, and the aura of his voice was so creepy and so angry. I was so shocked and creeped out, because he seemed angry at me. I removed my earpiece quickly, and moved on with the others. I'm the only foreigner in our class, so the explanation I give to myself for the earpiece thingy was that it was the man, and he was angry at me for being there. My parents got divorced when I was about 12. Some minor things happened in the first few places we lived in. We moved into this apartment complex when I was about 14. The manager ever so kindly let us know that the previous tenant passed away. Well, isn't that just lovely? So in that apartment a lot of weird stuff happened. Once a big glass Pyrex measuring cup fell off the counter and shattered on the floor. I had made sure I put it down no less than 5 inches away from the edge. My cat had been sleeping on the couch the entire time. My cat used to mess up the lower cabinet doors, making them open a bit then close with a bang. One night I woke up because the cabinet doors were banging around. I got up, dragged my exhausted ass to the kitchen and yelled at her to stop. But I didn't see her anywhere in the kitchen. And then I remembered she wasn't even in my apartment. We had taken her up to my grandmother's earlier that week. When I was 16, I was sitting in the living room with my then boyfriend, being silly and taking pictures with a digital camera. Every picture we had taken that afternoon were all weird. There were orbs, drastic lighting changes and weird streaks of light, and faces reflected in the computer monitor that was off. And the faces didn't belong to either of us. To debunk the pictures, I cleaned up the camera lens, cleaned the monitor, and made sure the lamp wasn't being too glitchy, and took a few more pictures. The orbs and faces didn't reappear, but the weird lighting and streaks did. I set the camera down because it freaked me out, and the next day when I wanted to show my best friend the pictures, they were all gone. All but one. Of me and my boyfriend sitting next to each other. Never could explain it. That was about 10 years ago, and I'm still dealing with a lot of weird stuff that's happening in the house I currently live in. I saw my grandmother's ghost. I was 6 years old. We lived in upstate New York, just outside of New York City. Grandma Catherine lived in Chester County, and I have zero memory of her aside from this. One night, I woke at about 4 in the morning, walked into my parents' bedroom and sat in the leather-winged chair my father sat in when he read. Across the room was my father's closet. The door opened, and Grandma Catherine walked to me about 6 feet in front of me, smiled, sort of bent from the waist and said, "I just wanted to say goodbye." Then she turned, went back into the closet, before closing the door behind her, and I went back to bed. About 2 hours later, the phone rang. 10 minutes after that, my mother came into my bedroom to tell me that Grandma Catherine had passed away. "I know," I said. "What?" my mother asked, gasped, and I told her my story. She made me retell it 2 or 3 times, then gripped me on the shoulder hard and made me swear on my eternal soul that I would never tell my father the story. Freaked the hell out as only a 6-year-old can be, I agreed. I never told him the story either. He lived another 15 years and never heard it. By the way, I don't believe in ghosts, but I know that I saw my grandmother's one. How Aristotelian is that? I was fortunate enough to grow up on a lovely little secluded piece of land in Canada. I had a large house which was backed by beautiful forests and woodland. I never wanted much in the way of entertainment, as myself and my brother Gabriel had plenty of games to play in the dense forest, which kept us busy for most of the day. I was homeschooled and spent a lot of my time in and around that forest, and grew to love it and know it like the back of my hand. My family is not very spiritual. My dad was an atheist, my mother a very casual Catholic. I think I might have gone into church twice in my life. Despite this, Dad didn't like us going deep into the forest. Mum, much the same. They said it had funny vibes, some gun instinct, I guess. They didn't have a problem with me and Gabe going into the forest, as long as we were sensible, were together, and did not go in too deep. We had enough of a feel for what was too deep to never cause a problem by venturing too far and getting lost or anything, but we would often still push into the woods a bit to explore new areas. There were some nights where I would be woken up by blue flashes coming through my window, as if someone taped cellophane over a flashlight and was sporadically turning it off and on from above the canopy deep in the woods. Other nights, if the wind carried just right, you could hear voices in the dead of night. Sometimes conversations, sometimes wailing or shouting. Other times, whispers. Sometimes all three. I could never really hear what was being said. The woods stretched out for kilometers, and to my knowledge was uninhabited, where the lights and noises came from. On one particular occasion the activity climaxed. I was about 14. Me and Gabe wandered further than we ever had. We reached a point, and it was like something snapped. It was hard to describe. It was like the feeling you get when you break something, and you know you're about to get caught. We turned back pretty quickly. I think something followed us out of the woods. A few hours later I was reading in the living room, which had a big glass sliding door that faced the backyard and trees. That is when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A humanoid dude, probably 6 feet tall, was beckoning me from the tree line. He had wild, untamed hair, sickly, hairless skin, and didn't appear clothed. He just kept on beckoning, with this awkward, stiff movement of his arm. There was something totally off about him. I screeched for my dad, and when I did, the guy walked behind the nearest tree and vanished out of sight. I explained to my dad what I saw and looked outside, but found nothing. He told me I probably imagined something from my book. I know I definitely did not. My husband and I bought a townhouse back in September of 2017, and we've had super weird things happen since. Most of these experiences have happened on our second story. For background, where the stairs come up to my office is immediately to the left. Then there is a long hall to the right with the hallway bathroom. The laundry room just past that is my son's room on the other side, and the master bedroom at the very end of the hall. The access to the attic is in the master bedroom closet. As our family goes, it's me, my husband, our son, and our 2 large dogs. When we first moved in, our son was barely 3 years old and had just started making full sentences. He would be playing all day without any issues, but whenever it started to get dark outside, he began getting nervous and wouldn't want to be in his room. He'd come downstairs at one point saying, "Mummy, do you hear it?" "Hear what, kiddo?" "The baby's crying, Mummy." My son is an only child, so you can imagine my confusion at this time. I came upstairs with him and asked him where he was hearing it from, thinking he may be hearing the neighbors through the wall. He took my hand and pulled me towards the master bedroom, stopping just a short over the threshold. He pointed to the darkest corner of the room and said, "Over there. The baby's crying over there." My body went numb. I tried to brush it off and told him there's no baby there and he's just imagining it. This persisted for about a month before he finally stopped talking about the crying baby. During this time I had been doing research on our house, and there had been no deaths in that house that I could find, let alone any kids that lived in the house before us. A few weeks after my son stopped mentioning the baby, I started hearing scratching noises above my head in the attic. I told my husband and he thought we had raccoons or some other animal living in the attic. He went up a few days later, but found nothing. I'm normally a heavy sleeper, but at least twice a week I would wake up to hear a faint scratching noise directly above me. I did my best to try and ignore it and go back to sleep. This seemed to work, as we hadn't had an issue for a while up until recently. I have always felt somewhat uneasy on the second floor, but I just attributed it to my past paranormal experiences growing up and being a little paranoid. Now, I'm thinking my senses were on point. A few months ago, my husband and I were talking about how our son had this weird affinity for the crying baby when he was younger, and I had mentioned that one day when I was taking a nap, I woke up abruptly, being sideways on the bed with one leg hanging off towards the closet, almost like I was being dragged towards it. However, I don't remember being pulled at all. All I do is flop around a lot in my sleep, so I brushed it off. After I told my husband about this, he frowned a little bit and said he had a weird experience too recently. Apparently, he woke up one morning around 2:30 a.m. and saw a figure standing by his side of the bed. He said it was all black, and he couldn't really make out a face or any distinct features. He went to kick the figure, thinking maybe someone had broken into the house, and his foot went right through it. This freaked him out a little bit, but he's a firm believer that if you don't acknowledge paranormal things, they can't do anything. So of course he rolls over and goes to sleep, and doesn't even think to mention it to me until I told him about my own experience. The whole time we've been here, the dogs will randomly get spooked or will stare at something that I don't see. Every once in a while, our wolf hybrid, who's typically scared of his own shadow, will get very upset, and his hair will stand on end, and he will emit a low but vicious growl. Our other dog is a Malinois/Black Lab mix, but she's getting old and is 10 years old now, and doesn't really do much other than sleep on her bed and try to get all the pets and treats from us. And this brings us to the present. Yesterday there was a decent storm that came through our area. It was semi-dark out, and thunder every once in a while. I'm working from home during the virus pandemic, and my mum had come to pick up my son around 11:30 so that I could work in peace without my son continually bothering me. A few hours later, I'm listening to a podcast while working, and I hear a faint mumble that almost sounded like, "Mummy?" The chilling thing is that it sounded exactly like my son. I turned around to tell him that he needed to go back to his room and not bother me while I was working. But as I was turning, I remembered he wasn't even home. I was here, alone, with the dogs. There was no one behind me, and no one down the hall. At this point, I try to brush it off, thinking my mind is playing a trick on me, when my wolf hybrid starts losing it. All his hair stands on end. He gets between me and the door and starts doing this low growl. This freaked me out a little bit, but I told him to stop, which he listened to, and laid back down, but without taking his eyes off the hallway. About an hour later, I was in the zone with work, and was talking to a co-worker on our team chat. They sent me something funny enough to make me audibly laugh. I then heard a tiny giggle that sounds exactly like my son, coming from his room down the hall, who still isn't home at this point. I nearly fall out of my chair with how scared I was. I got up and checked all the rooms upstairs, but I was home alone like I had thought. I had to get back to work as we were starting to get busy, but I was on edge and straining to hear if anything else was happening behind me. 10 minutes later, I hear the crash of something relatively small but still loud downstairs. My dogs run down the steps while I follow behind them. My PlayStation controller, which was originally on the charging stand behind the TV, was in the middle of the living room floor. This made my blood run cold, as we had not had anything physically moved yet, and I was having a full-blown panic attack. I called my husband, who was already on his way home, and said he would be there soon. When he got home, everything seemed to have stopped. This all happened from 2 to 4:30 in the middle of a little thunderstorm. I've looked into it, and from what I can gather, when something can mimic voices, it's typically evil or demonic. Should I be worried? What do I do in this situation? I don't want to scare my son, and we can't move, but I'm extremely paranoid and scared to be home alone right now. This happened to me and my 2 friends when I was 14. When I was a young kid, I was very rebellious, and also the only child. I lived with my mom and my stepdad. My mom worked long hours, and so did my stepdad, who used to leave for work every day at 5 a.m. My mum worked 6 to 7 hours at a care home for the elderly. After school, me and my two best friends loved going to the park opposite my flat where we'd talk, run around, play truth or dare, just girly things. One thing about this park was that it had a forest just at the end, which was rumoured to be haunted. We didn't believe in such things yet, but they excited us. Once we got very close to it and saw a few things, such as a mattress, blanket, toilet paper and some food. To me, it looked like a homeless person may have found shelter there, so I didn't look into it too much. But the boys at school said that there were devil worshippers. Again, we found this to be absurd and continued going to the park. One day it was dark around 8 p.m. and we were still there. We were playing around on the swings when suddenly I realized my phone was missing from my pocket. This was extremely weird, as I'd always kept a good eye on my phone because my parents would be pissed if I ever lost it. I told my friends that it was gone, and we began looking everywhere for this phone. Around the playground where it had to be because we'd walked straight through the metal gate. It wasn't there. I panicked hard, more and more, and we began searching further away. We were now by the lake looking for my phone when Ali said, "I found it." I looked to where she was pointing to, and to my relief I saw my phone and couldn't be more thrilled. But what happened next made me sick. Next to my phone was a heart and some kind of organ. It looked like an intestine. The heart had a hole through it, which I noticed right away and pointed out. We were shocked and confused and honestly scared. After my friend Ali took a video with her phone, we then went to walk my friend Jamie to the bus stop and go home when we noticed a bright light shining from the forest. Now, the right decision would be to keep going and turn back, but we were 14 and a bit stupid, so decided to investigate, as we wanted to get to the bottom of where the guts came from. All three of us walked towards it, giggling and laughing, thinking it was a joke, until we got closer still. It was too close, and we could see something in the darkness. It appeared to be a man, but could have been a woman. It was hard to say, and they had a stick sticking out from the back. As soon as we saw it, we quickly began to run back into the main road, as this was no longer funny. Whoever was towards us did not have good intentions. While we ran, my friend Ali fell over. I quickly grabbed her and pulled her up as we continued running. We successfully made it onto the same road. Once we did, we looked back to see the person retreating back into the forest. Fair to say we were shaken up. We never went back to that park again. I'm now 20 years old and still cannot understand what happened that night, or what could have happened. We had nightmares for a while after this event, and we never spoke of it again.